28. Sin City. Barely 2 weeks after Singer Presents Elvis aired in December 1968, the Colonel accepted the deal to take Elvis into the $60 million yet-to-be-built International Hotel, Kirk Kerkorian's oasis of refinement in the Vegas desert. The showroom, with 2,000 seats, would be the largest in town. Alex Schufe, nicknamed the Cleaver for his attention to the bottom line during his years at the Sahara and the Flamingo, was a good match for the Colonel. When the two sat down at the negotiating table, Schufe, now married to Joan Adams, the girl who had pushed Elvis off the couch in her trailer years before, told Parker the hotel would be very pleased to have Elvis, but they had to face facts. After so many years in Hollywood, he was unproven as a stage act. He hadn't even appeared in Vegas in 12 years, and in 1956, he hadn't exactly set the town on fire, you know. The Colonel, intent on outmaneuvering the long-faced Canadian, fixed his antediluvian eyes on him and told him that was all in the past, before the movies, before the TV special. Elvis had his old fans and his new fans. The International would offer 1,500 rooms, 2.5 times the size of Caesar's Palace, but they'd have no trouble filling them when his client was in town. Vegas had never seen the kind of business Elvis would generate, and the Colonel would see to it personally. "You're going to find out what an opening is like when Elvis comes in," Parker boasted, closing his deal with a jab of his cane and then waving it across an invisible map. "They'll come from all over the world." Schufe raised a thick eyebrow, pondered the thought, and then shook his head yes. In late July 1969, Elvis would kick off a 4-week engagement of 2 shows a night, 7 nights a week. No other entertainer had ever committed to such a grueling schedule, usually taking Monday or Tuesday off. As compensation, Parker demanded $100,000 a week, out of which Elvis and the Colonel would pay the musicians and backup vocalists. "Mark my words," Parker declared, "Elvis will be the first star in Las Vegas to make money for the showroom, apart from whatever his fans drop out in the casino. You'll never have an empty seat, I can promise you that." Elvis, meanwhile, concerned himself more with what he'd promised Steve Bender to maintain his artistic credibility. On January 6th, 2 days before his 34th birthday, Elvis took a meeting with Felton Jarvis, who drove over to Graceland from Nashville to discuss Elvis's next record. Marty Lacker was there, and for a while he just listened to what the two men had to say. Marty was now running a small record label and working closely with Chips Moman at his American studio there in Memphis. He had already reminded Elvis that Chips was one of the founders of Stax Records, and that 164 hit records had come out of his little rundown studio at 827 Thomas Street in just the last 18 months. Red had recorded his own stuff there recently, too, and though he and Elvis still weren't speaking, George Klein also prompted Elvis to think about cutting his next record at American. Maybe there was something magical in those North Memphis walls. Elvis hadn't recorded in his hometown since the Sun years, and it might put some of that deep-dish soul back in his music, Marty told him some months earlier. It would be his most logical album setting in years, but Elvis had only said he'd think about it. Jerry Lieber, who wrote so many of Elvis's hits with his partner Mike Stoller, knew that Elvis's music was really white music with black undertones, but that there was no getting around that Memphis place where a lot of different things came together at the right time, at the point it was ready to happen. Maybe it was time for that to happen again, Marty said, speaking now to both Elvis and Felton. Nothing against Nashville, of course, but a lot of the records that came out of there sounded like something turned out of a factory. Felton knew what Marty meant. He knew, too, that Moman had a group of players there, particularly Reggie Young on lead guitar, Bobby Emmons and Bobby Wood on keyboards, Gene Chrisman on drums, and Tommy Cogbill and Mike Leach on bass, who'd mastered a hand-in-glove synthesis of pop and rhythm and blues. After the television special, Marty saw that it could go either way. And Chips kept saying, "When are you going to tell Elvis to let me produce a record?" It took a bit of arm twisting, but before Marty and Felton left that day, Elvis had agreed. and during the first 2 months of 1969, he would record some of his most enduring music, including Suspicious Minds, Kentucky Rain, In the Ghetto, and Long Black Limousine. It would have taken a complete fool not to hit with Elvis Presley if you had the songs, Moman says. But in getting the right songs to him, the project would be fraught with tension, as both RCA and the Colonel threw up obstacles and hurdles about studio policy and publishing rights. That put Lamar, now working for Elvis's publishers, Hill and Range, and Marty, who was Chips's friend and also moonlighted as a song plugger, in the middle. A confrontation quickly ensued over the publishing rights to Suspicious Minds, which Moman controlled, as well as Mac Davis's In the Ghetto, which Moman thought was a perfect statement for a man whose music sprang in part from Black culture. Davis, like so many songwriters before him, including the great Otis Blackwell, all shook up, relented, and gave up part of his publishing for Elvis to record the song. But Moman held firm. Their deal was that they weren't going to record any song that they didn't have the publishing on. I was ready to erase the tapes and just let it go. I ended the session and sent the musicians home and asked all of Elvis's people to leave my studio. Parker told his lieutenant, Tom Diskin, that if Moman didn't play ball, they'd figure a way around him or simply scrap the sessions. But RCA's Harry Jenkins knew that Suspicious Minds could be a huge career record for Elvis, and at the next day's session, he mediated for the greater good. Elvis would cut in, and Chips would keep his publishing. Lost in the battle was the fact that without a Steve Bender there to fuse his backbone, Elvis made no attempt to persuade the Colonel that the material was right for him, or to stand up and say he was going to have the song, publishing rights be damned. That summer, Suspicious Minds became Elvis's first #1 single in 7 years, and though he would never see another, the sides from the American studio sessions ranked among the finest work of his career. Eventually, they covered 2 albums. From Elvis in Memphis, the first to be released, earned a lead review in Rolling Stone magazine. Looking at it again as a reissue in 2001, the magazine still found it remarkable, James Hunter calling it new as polyester, yet old as leather, religiously involved, yet flashy as neon, refined like pop, yet savage like rock and roll. The Elvis Presley of 1969 was a more mannered and complex adult version of the 50s kid with the nerve to combine the gnawing friction of the blues, the flourishes of gospel quartets, the zinging concision of pop, and the melodic leisure of country. Elvis was on such a fiercely creative roll that it could only have been stultifying to have to return to Hollywood in March. There he honored the second half of his commitment with NBC, teaming with Mary Tyler Moore for Universal Pictures' Change of Habit. Though he would make 2 concert films for MGM in the 1970s, this was his last narrative motion picture. Change of Habit was measurably better fare than the likes of Stay Away Joe or Clambake, in that it offered a dramatic role and only a handful of songs, but it presented little in the way of challenge. As Dr. John Carpenter, the head of a free ghetto clinic, Elvis finds himself with the unexpected help of 3 young women, nuns in street clothes, who never reveal their true vocations. Dr. Carpenter falls for Sister Michelle Gallagher, Moore, but the film foregoes a happy ending, framing Sister Gallagher in church, struggling with her vows. Moore, whose range of characters spans the perpetually buoyant Mary Richards, the Mary Tyler Moore Show, to the bitter, raging mother of ordinary people, seems somewhat embarrassed by Change of Habit, joking that Elvis has said on the record, "I slept with all my leading ladies except one." Well, I don't mean to bust anyone's cover, but I know who the one is. And what was I thinking? It wasn't strictly true, of course. He hadn't slept with all his leading ladies. But putting the words Elvis and none in the same sentence always seems to make people smile. That includes one of his earliest acquaintances in Tupelo, Barbara Spencer, for decades a member of the Sisters of Charity of Nazareth. Gladys and my mother were friends, and my mother loved to tell that I slept with Elvis. However, it was when we were infants. They even put us in the same crib sometimes. Change of habit was yet another different direction for Elvis. It marked the first time he played a professional man, and he didn't exactly get the girl. But the film seemed more like an after-school special for the preteen set than a movie of the week. Elvis never quite commanded the bearing of a doctor, and his scenes with Moore were so preposterously wrong-headed as to render the two the least likely couple in the universe. It was a dreary, if emblematic, end for an actor whose talent was misused, misunderstood, and all but choked off by the big screen. He came to Hollywood a greasy golden boy dripping with sexuality, observed entertainment journalist Steve Pond. He left an entertaining, safe icon. As Elvis finished his film obligations, Parker was busy mounting a colossal promotion and advertising campaign, drawing on his background as an advance man for the carnivals to build Elvis into the biggest act in Vegas. "He just loaded this hotel," remembered Shufi. "He had every billboard in the entire city, not only in Vegas, but leading all the way to California. There was so much excitement, it was unbelievable. We got calls from all over the world. We couldn't accept all the reservations." Parker had insisted that Elvis be the second star in the new showroom, not the first, so that the hotel could work out any of the bugs with the lights or sound before Elvis went in. Barbra Streisand was the International's opening draw then, but by 5 a.m., after the close of her engagement, anticipation for Elvis was so great that fans were already standing 3 blocks deep to get into the hotel, and the lobby was jam-packed. Parker, meanwhile, stayed up all night plastering Elvis posters, banners, and flags all over the elegant walls and installing Elvis stand-ups in the lobby. Management bit their tongues and went along with it. Hotel employees donned straw hats with Elvis plaques on the front, while croupiers added red, white, and blue Elvis armbands. "They looked like riverboat gamblers," says Imperial's member Joe Mascheo. "Honestly, it was a very strange atmosphere." In May, Elvis took Priscilla and Lisa Marie back to Hawaii on vacation for 2 weeks. He needed time to think, to formulate the show, and he wanted the kind of deep Hawaiian tan that would be seen from the last row of the showroom. Since he never flew commercially under his own name, he booked the family as the Carpenters, using the name of his change of habit character. As always, he brought along a retinue, adding the Fikes to the previous year's party of the Espositos, the Gambills, and Charlie Hodge. They spent their weekdays at the Alikikai Hotel in Honolulu and moved to the more intimate Coco Palms on Kauai for the weekend. Priscilla, her overinflated hairstyle a laughable memory, was now much more comfortable in asserting herself and stepping out of her role as Elvis's wife. She was still refining the changes in her appearance, growing her hair long and straight to her waist, and lightening it to a honey brown, for example, and choosing her own style of dress. Now more serious about her dance lessons, she had also taken up photography and delighted in decorating the new house. She would still say that her biggest ambition was to be a complete person, but she had recognized that the marriage was never going to work, that she had entered into a pure fantasy and an impossible, unworkable dynamic with a man who was by turns a father figure and a boy. "I need an equal," she would say. "I need a relationship with a man I can grow with." Then she would be beguiled by him again and lapse into the old patterns. Elvis brought out this mothering quality. I cut his meat up for him. I tasted it before he ever had it. I would fix his deviled eggs, cut off the top, put his butter in, prepare all his food as a mother would for a child. I would test it to see if it was too hot, even making his coffee. I loved doing it for him. We'd all baby him. Then you'd see him on stage and he looked so strong and virile. It was like, oh my God, but there was this child that was still in there. By the time they landed in Hawaii, Priscilla was tired of all of it, of the guys who surrounded them to the point of suffocation, of the upside-down hours of living someone else's life. "It was never about me," she would say. "It was really about him on every level." She reached her threshold on the weekend they checked into the Coco Palms Hotel and rented the King and Queen huts. the individual cottages among the coconut trees in the rear of the property. It was there that they had their biggest fight about their sex life, Joe remembers. We had one suite and they had the other, and the headboards of the beds were back to back. My wife and I were asleep, but we could hear them right through the wall. The tropical setting had put Priscilla in an amorous mood, especially since so much of Blue Hawaii had been shot on the grounds. But again, Elvis put her off. In Joe's recollection, Elvis thought it was like making love to his mother. He just had a hang-up about it. And Priscilla kept yelling at him, "You never make love to me anymore." It had a lot to do with their relationship, naturally. I'm sure they had sex a little bit after the baby, but he wasn't thrilled with it. That night, he didn't say why. He just screamed and yelled back at her. But that's one of the reasons the marriage fell apart. Elvis spent the rest of May, June, and July working up material with Charlie, or Charlie, as he pronounced the little man's name. He wanted only the best musicians and songs. And as a fan of Mario Lanza, Jan Pierce, and Roy Orbison, Elvis was eager for songs that would let him show off the voice he'd kept hidden so long, one that could now handle sustained high notes and operatic endings. His artistry had never been so well developed, Charlie saw. He would be Billy Eckstine. He would be Bill Kenny of the Ink Spots. He would be Hank Snow. All these people became Elvis Presley. He had all these people inside him. In choosing the musicians, Elvis spoke to nearly every good player he'd known, including Billy Goldenberg, whom he wanted as his arranger, musical director, but who declined, citing previous commitments. For now then, he'd go with Bobby Morris, who led the 30-piece international orchestra. To lead his own band and help audition the players, he settled on famed Louisiana guitarist James Burton, who had come out of Ricky Nelson's late 1950s group and gone on to become a top LA session musician. And for backing voices, he chose not one, but two groups, the gospel-based Imperials, a white male act, and the Sweet Inspirations, a black female quartet that had backed Aretha Franklin. It was a hell of a big stage to fill, he told Charlie. What he hoped for, he remarked to James, pulling on what he learned in the television special, was a sound that would bring together all of the diverse American traditions, black and white, sacred and secular, that had influenced him. Our music was from the same school, explains Burton, who, like Elvis, got his start on the Louisiana hayride. He needed to have that strong background, that drive, and he liked to have a lot of voices back there singing and really pushing. He had a natural feel for the way the tempo should be, and how the background should surround his vocal. He knew the feeling he wanted. Now he was trying to think of everything, including the way he'd interact with the fans, so he could get in the habit of being in public again, dealing with the crowds. He made concerted efforts to go down and sign autographs at the gates. He wasn't sleeping well, though, worrying if he could sustain his voice over such a long engagement, with 2 full-hour sets a night. And he was short-tempered, partly out of nerves, and because he was working hard at staying skinny, hovering around 168 pounds. He wanted his cheekbones to show in the photographs. Most of all, he wanted to be able to fit into his new Bill Ballou-designed outfits. Ballou, who had never worked in Vegas before, originally made his stage costumes in a variety of colors, including red and blue, Elvis's favorite. Then he discovered that white worked best to accommodate the changing colors of the lights. The first thing I said was, I will not dress him like Liberace. Elvis, for me, was a very macho man. I did not feel that all the furs and feathers and sequins were right for Elvis, so the jumpsuits and macrame belts I did for him in the beginning were very subdued. Some of them, however, like the white Cossack-style suit, accented with a dangling macrame belt, played up Elvis's androgynous beauty and made him contemporary with many of rock's leading figures, who favored a flowing, feminized style of dress. He wore the outfit for at least 2 of his 3 run-throughs of the performance with full orchestra accompaniment on July 31st, only hours before the show opened at 8:15 p.m. For days, he suffered the kind of debilitating panic attacks that crippled him just before the Singer special. If he seemed at 34 to be the king of the oldie-moldy goldies, or simply fought off technical problems, it would be reported in the press both domestically and overseas, where he had such a stronghold of fans. That would affect business and future touring, which he hoped to resume in 1970. He would also have to face the invitation-only audience, studded with such celebrities as Cary Grant, Paul Anka, Carol Channing, Fats Domino, Wayne Newton, Anne Margaret, and Roger Smith. And most important, Sam Phillips, who had started it all. He was so jittery, in fact, that he asked Joe to tell Marty Lacker and George Klein not to come until the second night. He would start his 2 shows a night schedule then, and he was afraid the showroom would be half empty. But when he finally hit the stage at 10:15, following warm-up sets from the Sweet Inspirations and comedian Sammy Shore, he buried his nervousness in the bravado of the rock and roll beat, walking out onto stage left unannounced and winking to the Imperials as he passed. Just as he shuffled on stage at his high school variety show, he hesitated for a moment, as if summoning his courage. Then he churned through a repertoire that burned the fires of nostalgia, blue suede shoes, and thrilled with the soulful tenderness of the Memphis sessions. He was as much athlete as aesthete, falling to his knees, sliding across the stage, even turning a somersault. The crowd leapt to its feet and stayed there. Both the establishment and the counterculture press, including the New York Times, the Village Voice, and the New Yorker, rushed to praise, and even the seen-it-all pit bosses said they couldn't remember such excitement on an opening night. There to share it was June Juanico, who seemed to speak for most of the women in the audience. "Oh my God, he was still the most gorgeous creature I have ever laid eyes on. I could hardly control my heart. It was just jumping out of my chest. He knew I was in the audience, and I had to pretend I wasn't in love with him because I was with relatives, you know? That was not an easy thing." When the Colonel greeted Elvis backstage, he was visibly moved and pulled out of a quick embrace to contain his emotion. Then he made his way to the hotel coffee shop to join Alex Schufe, the International's president. There, in blue ballpoint ink, they turned a badly stained tablecloth into a contract, figuring Elvis's engagement would break all Vegas records, grossing $1,522,635 with an attendance of 101,500. The hotel boosted his salary to $125,000 a week and extended its option for 2 engagements a year for 5 years, through 1974. The Colonel, who always bled a deal for the extra drop, gouged Schufe for a trip to Hawaii for Elvis and 8 companions. The short man smiled, the fat man grinned, and the two shook hands. Secretly, Schufe knew he'd just made the best deal in Vegas history, and he'd done it standing on the back of Elvis Presley. Parker had hit the $1 million mark again and crowed that he had negotiated the most money ever for 8 weeks of work in Vegas. But he hadn't demanded a sliding scale, and instead had signed Elvis to 5 years for the same amount of money, without an increase. Why? To protect his own interests with the hotel, for Parker was the most pathological of gamblers. He couldn't lose money fast enough. "The Colonel was one of the best customers we had," Alex Schufe later reported. "He was good for $1 million a year." But others later questioned that figure, saying it was too conservative. The truth was that Parker routinely lost between $50,000 and $100,000 a night during Elvis's engagements, the hotel treating him like royalty, roping off tables for his private play 12 or 14 hours at a stretch. While Parker was figuring Elvis's future in numbers on a coffee-marked table covering, Steve Bender was discovering that the Colonel had barred him from going backstage. It would be 30 years before he found out Elvis had been expecting him, eager to get his feet back. "I was convinced at the time he left the '68 special that he had a whole different mindset of what he wanted to do with his life. And quickly that window of opportunity was shut tight, and he ended up being a saloon singer in Vegas just to indulge the Colonel's gambling habits." As Elvis's guests and friends filtered back to congratulate him, he told them what he repeated the next day to reporters, that he'd been a little nervous for the first 3 songs, but then I thought, what the heck, get with it, man, or you might be out of a job tomorrow. Patty Perry was there, as much for support as to see the show, and sat near him to help quell his butterflies. As celebrities filed through his dressing room, Elvis looked around nervously for Anne Margaret and Roger Smith and invited them up to the suite later on. Then, hoping to impress Roger, he leaned over to Patty and whispered in her ear, "Go put on every piece of jewelry I ever gave you." At his press conference the next afternoon, wearing a black suit with a standing collar and an accent scarf of bloody orange at his neck, he resembled not so much a Vegas performer as a European prince, at once modern and timeless. The questions were predictable, his answers sometimes not. "Did you enjoy performing live again?" came a voice. "Yes, this has been one of the most exciting nights of my life." "How does your wife feel about you being a sex symbol again?" "I don't know. You would have to ask her." "Why have you led such a secluded life?" "It's not secluded, honey. I'm just sneaky." Elvis had gone into the engagement without a serious girlfriend. He had called Celeste Yarnall and made it clear he wanted her to come be with him, be his lady, but she turned him down. She had a brand new collie puppy, she said, which was true. But the larger issue was that I was married still, even though I was separated, and I just knew it would be the wrong decision for me to enter into that lifestyle. I didn't go to the Hollywood parties, never drank or smoked, went to bed early. Maybe if I had said yes, I would have been the Linda Thompson in his life. Who knows? On August 16, 1969, 24-year-old Joyce Bova, a junior member of the Armed Services Committee of the United States House of Representatives in Washington, D.C., came to Las Vegas on vacation. With her was a girlfriend, Anne Marie Wade, a huge Elvis fan. Anne Marie couldn't believe it when Joyce lucked into a pair of comps to his show on their third night, but they were a gift from Paul Anka, who had inadvertently embarrassed her with an offhand comment during his own performance. Joyce and Anne Marie were waiting in line for their passes on August 19th, when suddenly a greeter from the International plucked them from the line and asked if they'd like to meet Elvis, right then before the second show. It seemed a most peculiar series of events, but Joyce and Anne Marie went with the flow and soon found themselves being led down a maze of hallways and into a room with Vernon Presley and the members of the Memphis Mafia. Everyone was waiting for Elvis. Joyce worked with famous people every day, but when he finally walked through the door, I wasn't prepared for how beautiful he was. Beautiful. That was the word for it. Elvis inspired not so much desire in her, she would write in her memoir, "Don't ask forever, my love affair with Elvis Presley," but a mixture of curiosity and awe. Elvis responded to her in kind. For Joyce, striking, so petite as to be tiny, with long dark hair and the olive skin of her Sicilian heritage, had the exotic looks that always caught his attention. Joe could see why. Pretty girl, black hair, beautiful eyes, and a dancer attracted him tremendously, and they just hit it off. He laid his usual flirtatious prattle on her, arranged for her and Anne Marie to sit in his booth, and invited her back after the show. Joyce felt almost lightheaded watching him perform, and just then it occurred to her, seeing him with all the shrieking women, that he might be expecting more from her than she was prepared to give. She promised herself she wouldn't let it get out of hand. But once she was back in his private dressing room, she could feel an intensity from him. The way he gripped her hand, the way he moved too fast. Suddenly, a woman came up and mistook her for Priscilla, an easy thing to do, and she could feel her face flush. Things might have ended there, especially as Anne Marie had promised Paul Anka that they would come see him backstage. But then Charlie was standing there with something for her to drink, and Elvis was babbling on about how unique she was, because he could just tell. And it was then that Joyce uttered the words that would capture Elvis's attention forever. "Actually, there are two of me," said the spunky brunette. "I have an identical twin sister." Elvis stared at her with a look of surprise and shock, but like he was trying to digest it, Joyce remembered in a rare interview for this book. And then his whole demeanor changed. Gone was the superstar pose and the man on the make. Suddenly, Elvis was just someone who'd lost a vital part of himself. "My little brother Jesse Guerin died when I was born," he told her. "You know, they say the twin who survives lives on, carrying the qualities of both, of the one who died." She thought she'd upset him, but as he talked on, she saw that the look was really one of discovery and recognition, that he had met someone who knew what it was like to be a twin. It turned out that Joyce was also the second-born, like Elvis, and in an odd way, this was his own personal reunion. Meeting her almost gave him the ability to look and see what might have been, if not for fate. Now he wanted to hear more about her sister. Joyce and Janice had been nearly inseparable since birth, she told him. They did everything together, even though Janice had recently married. "Do you miss her a lot?" he asked. "I mean, when you're away from her, like tonight?" Joyce told him she'd wished all night that Janice were there to share each amazing moment of her visit. "But of course I know she knows how happy I am." Elvis asked her what she meant. "Well, it's hard to explain, but Janice and I have always had this capacity to feel the other's emotions, no matter how many miles separate us from each other." Now he looked at her for what seemed like a long time, and she got the feeling that he had many questions he wanted answered. "Joyce," he said, "would you come up to the suite later and have dinner with me?" Oh, wow. Now she was stunned. Her hands turned to jelly. She didn't know about this. Suddenly, she felt as vulnerable as if she were naked. She was afraid. She'd had a strict Catholic upbringing in Baltimore, and her father was a sergeant on the Vice Squad. Her mother had been a dancer, and because of her own history with show people, she had imposed a relentlessly repressive regime on the twins their whole lives. And so Joyce turned Elvis down, saying she and Anne-Marie had promised to meet some people. He pressed her. "Is this some guy? You know, I can tell. Some guy you maybe just met?" She finally told him what was really on her mind, that she figured he picked a different girl each night, and tonight it was she, and that wasn't what she wanted. "I adore you," she said, "but no thank you." All he wanted was to get to know her better, he said. "Besides, you ought to realize that it's not physically possible for me to be with a different girl every night and still do what I do up on that stage." "Well," she said, though she felt a little sheepish, "there's also the fact that you're married." Now he was indignant. "What does married have to do with this? I just want to be with someone I can talk to. You should realize that with you, I would have to be a perfect gentleman, and that's a promise." And so she caved, she wrote, like a freshman congressman confronted by Tip O'Neill. Joyce was too nervous to actually enjoy her cheeseburger dinner with Elvis and the guys in his suite on the 29th floor of the International. But Elvis was intrigued with her. The fact that she was a twin, that she worked on Capitol Hill, and that her father was a cop. And so he asked her questions almost the entire time until she left at 5 a.m., when he had Gigi Gambill take her down and put her in a cab for her room at the Dunes. When she returned for a second dinner a few days later, she asked him point blank, "Why me?" His answer, "Trouble is, it's been a long time since I felt so comfortable with a woman." It made her dizzy. But that couldn't be true, could it? Elvis Presley? She didn't know what to think, especially when he asked her to stay in Vegas a few more days. "Believe me, I would love to, but the Congress of the United States doesn't recess for me." Before she left, he kissed her for the first time and asked for her home phone number. She scribbled it out quickly and put it in his palm, and he replaced it with a small diamond ring, a perfect stone set in finely wrought gold. "So you won't forget me," he said. A week later, he called her at 2 a.m. He wanted her to come back to see him, right then. And when he heard her sister was at the door, he seemed delighted. "Put her on," he said. "I want to meet her." 29. Girls, Guns, and the President. In October 1970, Elvis and Priscilla were back in Hawaii again, the colonel having held Alex Shufi's toes to the fire for the perk. Vernon and Dee, the Espositos, the Shillings, and the Gambills all came along at their invitation. Elvis had nothing scheduled until his return to the international stage in January, and while he'd once told Jerry that one of the most important lessons in life was being able to cope without anything to do, he was looking forward to the time off. Although there was always much to interest Elvis in Hawaii, for either work or play, after his huge fight with Priscilla there, the locale no longer seemed the paradise it once had. He never seemed to go anywhere else on vacation, one of the guys pointed out, and someone suggested that they all just continue their holiday in Europe. The Colonel always had some excuse why Elvis couldn't perform there, so if he were going to see any more of the continent than Germany and France, he needed to do it on his free time. They made a plan to return to the mainland, where they could pull some strings and expedite passports. But when the Colonel caught wind of the idea, he squelched it immediately, arguing that Elvis's rabid European fans would be insulted if he visited as a tourist before ever appearing in concert. As usual, Elvis relented and accepted Parker's suggestion to go to the Bahamas for 2 weeks instead. The Colonel had contacts there, he said, and they'd love the gambling and the deep-sea fishing. But the sea was too choppy for the latter, and the trip was largely a bust. Rain and hurricane winds kept them virtually trapped at the Paradise Island Hotel, where Elvis sat in with an Irish band, the Witnesses, and resumed fighting with Priscilla. The group returned home earlier than expected. On October 30th, gossip columnist Rona Barrett ran into Elvis at the blackjack tables, a girl on each arm. Her November 6th column carried a most candid item. Everybody is commenting on how good Elvis Presley looks these days while he's having fun at the International. Elvis's answer in response to such compliments? That's what a bad marriage does for you. In the middle of December, he started calling Joyce Bova again, asking her to come to California. She couldn't, she told him. Her committee was investigating the Miley incident. She was putting in 12-hour days. They went round about it again, and finally he just informed her he was making arrangements for her to come the following day. "I can't. Elvis, you know I can't," she pleaded. "I don't see why you can't come here." He started in, saying maybe she wasn't interested after all, and she snapped at him, blurting, "Anyway, what about your wife?" They exchanged a few tense words, and then she heard a click. When he went back to Vegas for 4 weeks on January 26, 1970, he was again the talk of the town and drew almost universal acclaim. The Los Angeles Herald-Examiner writing, "The new decade will belong to him." This time, Bill Ballou dressed him in one-piece jumpsuits made of stretch gabardine. "I got the idea from a karate suit," Elvis would say, which gave him freedom of movement. Most were either all black or all white, including a stunning white suit cut to the sternum with a necklace of rope at the neck. The reviewer for Life magazine, a Columbia University professor named Albert Goldman, later a controversial Presley biographer, took particular note of the costume and the male cheesecake who wore it. Though he savaged the outfit as effeminate and indicative of the star's immaculate narcissism, Goldman admitted that, "Not since Marlene Dietrich stunned the ringsiders with the sight of those legs encased from hip to ankle in a transparent gown has any performer so electrified this jaded town with a personal appearance." He also derided the fan reaction. "Watching the women in the audience lunge toward the stage like salmon up a falls becomes the show's real comic relief," he wrote. But Elvis managed very well with his constituency by occasionally grabbing a blue-haired lady at ringside and kissing her firmly on the mouth. Not all the ladies were blue-haired, by a long shot, and when Elvis returned in August, he would begin the ritual of handing out scarves to the women brave enough to make their way downstage. Charlie would stand behind him like a king's courtier, feeding what seemed to be an endless supply. Then Elvis would wipe his brow with one, and as the women screamed, shrieked, and elbowed one another for standing room, Elvis would religiously place one in their outstretched hands. It was rock and roll communion, Vegas style. Everything was coming together now, the return to the stage, the resurgence of fame, and the industry respect. Now it was time to test the waters for touring, to see if the faithful only came to Vegas, or if they were still out there, tucked away in the small towns and walking the streets of the bigger cities. At the end of February, he flew to Houston on Kirk Kerkorian's private jet. There, in his first performances outside Las Vegas since 1961, he played 4 concerts over 2 days at the Houston Livestock Show, breaking attendance records by some 10,000. Robert Hilburn, reviewing for the Los Angeles Times, called the first evening performance masterful. The appearances warranted a press conference, and Elvis said that while the size of the Astrodome was daunting, it's a big place, man. In a way, it felt like a homecoming, because he played so many early dates in the Lone Star State during his Louisiana hayride days. Yet at one point, the shows looked as if they might not happen after all, remembers the Sweet Inspirations' Myrna Smith. The promoters didn't want us to go because it was in Texas, and at that time they weren't as liberal as they are today. They told Elvis not to bring those black girls. Elvis replied, "Okay, but I'm not coming either." Then he went a step further by making a promoter's daughter drive the suites around in a limousine. For the second day's show, Priscilla flew in, just as the Houston papers reported rumors of the breakup of the marriage. Yet she was not the only woman he had seen in Texas lately. Elvis had been flying to Dallas routinely since October 1969, registering in hotels as John Burroughs, and spending time with a stewardess, and perhaps more than one. Lamar reports that Elvis was making trips to the American Airlines Stewardess College in Fort Worth and trolling for women, just as in his Army days. If, indeed, one of the world's most desired men flew around the country looking for girls, it speaks not only to his insatiable need for female companionship, and particularly the companionship of women who all dressed alike, as in twinship, but also to his desire to be the aggressor in relationships, since women had been literally fainting at his feet for decades. Soon he would start sending out for hookers in Vegas, but mostly for the guys, Joe says. We were so jaded by this point that it had become too much trouble to go out and look for women. They'd switch girls as the night wore on, but according to Joe, only on occasion would Elvis disappear in his room with one, saying he'd rather watch. His preference was almost always 2 women together. Elvis romanticized sex. Paying by the hour grounded it all too well. In Houston, reporters asked him if he still planned on making films. "I hope to," he said, and then laughed. "I'd like to make better films than I made before." But as far as he knew, there was nothing planned. He then deferred to the Colonel. "Is there anything in the workings?" "I can't commit myself," the crafty manager dodged. But in exactly 1 month, Parker closed a $500,000 deal with Kerkorian, the new owner of MGM Studios, for Elvis, That's the Way It Is, a documentary to chronicle his 1970 summer engagement at the International. The Colonel had sought twice that much, as the film would have a theatrical release. But with Oscar-winning director Dennis Sanders on board, it was still a prestige project. "He loved it," says Jerry. "He must have seen it 10 times. Elvis was particularly proud because the staging worked. He'd gotten so much opposition from the Colonel about having so many musicians and singers right around him, instead of hiding the band and sticking the singers way off to the side. He wanted it all out front, cocooning him, the way he liked to work in the studio. It was comforting. It was human touch almost, what he always desired the most. When Elvis finished his superstar engagement in Houston, he was off to California to play family man again, spending extended time with Priscilla. Despite the shakiness of the marriage, they went house hunting in Palm Springs, and in early April they found one to their liking at 845 Chino Canyon, making a $13,000 down payment and signing a mortgage for $85,000. Priscilla's husband seemed to be trying, she thought, but even though he threw her a surprise 25th birthday party in May, she still felt, I was always a little girl to him. When it came to selecting furniture for the Palm Springs house, they moved some of what they had in storage. But then Elvis chose the rest, and it was big and masculine and not her style at all. At the end of the year, as part of creating her own life, she would pick a new home in Los Angeles as well, spending $339,000 for a more private residence at 144 Monovale Drive in the Holmby Hills section of Beverly Hills. She decorated it herself with a more feminine touch, while keeping the big couches and modern furniture that pleased her husband. Now that they had Lisa, she felt they had outgrown the Hillcrest house, and on Monovale, there were 5 bedrooms, with 2 more bedrooms in the guest house, room to stretch out or accommodate the entourage and their spouses. She looked back at her former self and could hardly believe how she had lived. If he said, "That's a terrible color on you," I'd change my clothes immediately. For years, I was self-conscious that my neck was too long because Elvis always told me to wear my shirt collars up. Now I realize, you know all those pictures where he had his collar up? He was the one who was self-conscious about his neck. That hadn't really dawned on her when he started with Bill Bellew's Napoleonic collars, but now there was no denying it. As she continued to simplify her look and uncover her natural beauty, Elvis piled on his own plumage and wrapped himself in ever-increasing flamboyance and fantasy costumes. One white outfit was so fringy and bat-winged that when he raised his arms, he appeared to take flight, and he was already thinking jewel-encrusted capes for next year. When the first one arrived, Bill saw he was like a child who had gotten a new toy and couldn't wait to play with it. He would prance and dance around the floor, twirling the cape, and ask the guys, "What do you think? How do you like this?" In a way, Elvis was becoming his own skewed vision of the Priscilla he had dolled up and created, taking her from schoolgirl to Dracula's party queen overnight. It's true, Priscilla says. It was a flamboyance that he didn't have to do. It was a cry, I think. From that point on, he began to self-destruct. The self-destruction manifested itself in several ways, including a return to binge spending that rivaled his out-of-control habits at the ranch. 4 days after signing the mortgage on the Palm Springs house, he bought a 6-door 1969 Mercedes limo. He continued to indulge his taste in showy automobiles when he bought a 1971 Stutz Blackhawk, the first of its kind in Los Angeles, and gilded the lily and delivering it to George Barris for customizing. He'd buy more cars as the year wore on, another Mercedes for himself and one for Jerry, and while he was writing checks, a house for Joe, too. Then there were the gun sprees. In 3 nights, he dropped $20,000 on firearms at Kerr's Sporting Goods in L.A., 4 salesmen falling over themselves to keep up with him. He bought guns for anyone he could think of, girlfriends, the guys, even people off the street. And he became more obsessed with badges, with all the guys being deputized and armed at all times. It wasn't just about power and control, or even for protection when death or kidnap threats came, as several did in Las Vegas, beginning that summer of 1970. Deep down, it was part of his paradox, his lifelong obsession with authority, going back to Vernon's incarceration, his boyhood visits to the prison, and the shame that made his child's face flame scarlet. The latter half of the year also saw more expenses as Elvis began adding to his payroll. First, he brought RCA producer Felton Jarvis on the team, inducing him to quit his job and work directly for him. That June, they holed up in the record label's recently refurbished Studio B in Nashville and, as with the television special, blended players old and new. Scotty, DJ, and Floyd Kramer, among other stalwarts, joined newbies Norbert Putnam on bass and Jerry Kerrigan on drums. James Burton, the guitarist from Elvis's show band, held it all together as session leader. The first night, they captured 8 songs in 10 hours, running every style and tempo, and by the end of 5 nights, Felton had 35 masters in the can. Nothing rivaled the American studio masterworks, but Elvis would never have such a productive recording streak again, and the quality rode high. A gospel-flavored cover of Simon and Garfunkel's Bridge Over Troubled Water, an impassioned rendition of Dusty Springfield's ballad You Don't Have to Say You Love Me, and the modern pop of I've Lost You, Elvis's next single. The song seemed to speak to his domestic situation, even as outward appearances indicated otherwise. Norbert Putnam was surprised to see that while the food was catered, and the players were told to order anything they liked, Elvis was so sheltered that he never learned anything about cuisine, and always ate the same thing, a cheeseburger, fries, and a Coke. One night, Norbert told him that he learned to find the notes on the bass by listening to Elvis's first records. At the end of the conversation, he looked at me and took a deep breath and said, "Well, I guess it's time to go be Elvis." And I got chill bumps, because he went from being this regular guy to having this voice come out. He could go from this real deep baritone to a scream that Paul McCartney would love to be able to do every night, and I don't think he even thought twice about it. It was all natural to Elvis. It was subconscious. That August, Elvis made changes to his Vegas lineup. Joe Garcio came in as the hotel's new musical director, and now there was a new girl on stage, too. Millie Kirkham, the venerable session soprano, had been subbing for sweet inspiration Cissy Houston, who took off for a solo career. But Millie needed to get back to Nashville, so Kathy Westmoreland signed on for what was supposed to be 3 weeks. She would end up staying 7 years. At barely 25, Kathy was classically trained and immensely talented. Her high notes would summon angels. But though she was a top LA session singer, she was also idealistic and naive, believing in storybook love. She'd been with Elvis's band about 2 weeks when he invited her up to the suite. I thought it would be a party, but he said he just wanted to get to know me. When I walked in that room, there were all these knockout beautiful women waiting to meet Elvis. He came into the room and walked directly over and sat next to me. He asked about her family life, and he was intrigued that her father had sung in such MGM films as The Great Caruso and The Student Prince, which spoke to his Mario Lanza fixation. He also liked it that she was petite, only 5'1", and that she'd been runner-up in the Miss Teenage America contest in 1962. They connected right off. He told her about his marriage situation. I was a little uncomfortable with that, and stated flatly and unemotionally that he didn't have that much longer to live, that his family had died young. He told me that he knew exactly how much time he had, that he was going to die at the age of 42, close to the age of his mother. Kathy was taken aback, but found herself attracted to his mind, his humor, everything about him. He reminded me a lot of my own family. When she gave him her virginity, she thought they might actually make a go of it. They carried around the same metaphysical books. We were both on this search for the truth. And he told her Priscilla had no interest in the spiritual dimension. Though he insisted he had an open marriage, he kept on saying, "I wish she would divorce me so I wouldn't have to divorce her." Kathy knew he had other girlfriends and that she would be sandwiched in between. But when he said, "I love you," and then moved on, she was dazed and hurt, even as she had called a halt to the affair at one point, finding no valid excuse for adultery. The friendship, at least, would remain, along with the professional association. On stage, he called her the little girl with the beautiful high voice. Off stage, she was Minnie Mouse. That same August, he began seeing Kathy. He could no longer keep the strain of his life secret. On August 14th, 1970, he told the Vegas audience that he'd been hit with a paternity suit. A Los Angeles waitress named Patricia Ann Parker claimed she had become pregnant with his child during his engagement earlier that year. Pacing the stage, Elvis angrily detailed why it couldn't be true, using a vitriolic tone that shocked the majority of his audience. 12 days later came a major kidnap assassination threat, which sent Elvis and the guys into overdrive. The colonel called in the FBI and Private Detective John O'Grady, a former head of the LAPD Hollywood Narcotics Detail, who was already at work investigating the Patricia Parker case. For the next several nights, the entourage stood ready to move in, while Elvis performed with a pistol in each boot. An ambulance stood at the ready. Even Red, now back in the fold, was frightened. The lights were up in the audience more, and the curtains were closed, Red remembers. That was one of the strangest feelings I've ever had, because when he did his last song, he went down into a very low karate stance to make himself a small target, and Sonny and I came rushing out and stood in front of him, waiting for whatever was coming. But nothing did happen, except that Elvis became more on edge and crowed that he'd been more willing to take a bullet than let some son of a bitch bully him off the stage. It was about that time when Joyce Bova returned to Las Vegas, feeling odd about the way things had ended between them before they ever really began. On August 29th, she surprised him, showing up in town with her friend Karen for support. She dialed Joe, who put Elvis on the phone. "You must be psychic, honey. I was just about to call you," Elvis drawled, and he invited them to be his guests for the show. Afterward, in his private dressing room, he greeted Joyce warmly. "You're even more beautiful than the last time I saw you," he said as they hugged. "You don't know what it means to me, baby, having you here, but it sure took you long enough." Elvis had made it clear that Joyce would be going up to the suite later on, and so she left him alone as he milled about with his other guests, including Ricky Nelson's wife, Chris, and James Aubrey, president of MGM Studios. Aubrey, a powerful Hollywood player known as the Smiling Cobra, and the inspiration for Jacqueline Suzanne's 1969 best-selling book, The Love Machine, was there that night on business, since he had greenlighted the documentary, Elvis, That's the Way It Is. Elvis had already spotted Aubrey's date, Barbara Lee, an exquisite 23-year-old model and starlet sitting in the front center booth. She felt as though Elvis were making eye contact with her, but she wondered, why would he be looking at me? He could have any girl in this place. Then I'd be damned if he wouldn't be smiling at me again. As soon as she stepped into his dressing room that night, he couldn't take his eyes off her, Joe remembers. "Man," Elvis said to Sonny, "that's Venus sitting down over there." Barbara and James picked a table in the center of the room, and when James got up, Barbara barely had time to look around before Elvis swooped in and sat down next to me. He looked into my eyes, and that was it. We were both in lust, or love, or whatever you want to call it. It was like a thunderbolt. He snuck a tiny pencil and piece of paper under the table for my number, and I had no problems writing it down. What girl wouldn't have given him her number? He was the sexiest entertainer on the planet, and a beautiful soul. That was just too much to resist. Later that night, James wanted to make love, but Barbara's heart wasn't in it. She was back in that dressing room, reliving her conversation with Elvis. It seemed unreal. As a kid, she'd seen him on the Ed Sullivan Show. He was so free and alive, but her family was appalled at such shaking and swiveling, and when she got up and tried to move like he did, she was quickly sent to her room. It was too much to dream that she would meet him one day, let alone that he would want to be with her. Meanwhile, he was up in his new Imperial Suite, a blue and yellow penthouse that encompassed the entire 30th floor. When Joyce and Karen arrived, they found wall-to-wall guests, far more crowded than Joyce expected, though that was the norm according to Red. There always were a lot of people up there. He wanted an audience of just people to talk, to unwind. And of course, on a typical night, there was hundreds of girls. Sometimes he'd have other performers like Tom Jones or Andy Williams over, or just his own backup groups, the Imperials and the Sweet Inspirations, and they'd sing with him. One night, he put on a stack of 45s and asked Myrna Smith to dance. Elvis never flirted with black girls. He made up an excuse when he thought Diana Ross came on to him from the rolled-down window of her limousine, and this was just a friendly spin around the floor. Yet he was still just as uneasy at the idea of dancing as he had been at his parties back in Lauderdale Courts. Myrna thought at first that it was me shaking, but he was the one who was shaking. We finished the whole song. It was just a warm and comfortable feeling. He was so shy. It was great. Wonderful. But on this particular night, he was not in such a fine mood. Elvis sat around telling stories, going through the kidnapping thread in detail, laughing, boasting, and then in an abrupt mood change, he got surly with Joyce in front of everyone when she mentioned going to see Engelbert Humperdinck. To make up for it, he came over and picked up her hand and led her to one of the seating areas in the living room. She noticed his leg quivering. "Happens sometimes, baby. When I'm winding down after the show, you know? It's a back and forth thing, part of the highs and lows, the cycles of having to get myself up to do the show, then coming back down after again." But the tremor became more obvious, and then she noticed he was speaking much faster. He got up quickly and signaled the guys to start clearing the suite. Suddenly, she felt his arms around her, and his mouth was at her ear. "I need you to be with me tonight, honey. Please go to my room. I promise I'll be right there." Joyce felt a hot, shaky rush of emotion. She wasn't sure she wanted to do this, and then rose and led Karen into the bedroom to tell her privately that she wouldn't be going back to the hotel with her. But before they finished, Elvis jerked open the door. "Well, did you tell her?" His voice was harsh, and he bored a hole right through her. Karen hastily made her exit. When he got inside, he was even more brusque. "You staying or what?" Joyce felt as if she'd been slapped in the face. "What?" "You're standing there like you got one foot out the door." His eyes were cold now, and she could hardly believe he was the same person. He had changed so rapidly it scared her. "What have we got here, darling? A failure to communicate?" He shook his head at her. "I'm just using plain, simple English." It went back and forth, not getting any better, and then he pulled open a dresser drawer and barked, "If you're gonna stay, then stay, and get this on and get into that bed." Then he stormed into the bathroom. Joyce stood there stunned, the black silk pajama top he had flung at her still hanging from her shoulder. She could barely think straight. But then as she looked around at the suite, overblown and gaudy, she knew there was really only one thing to do. She brushed the flimsy top off and stepped on it on her way to the front door, slamming it so hard that the security guard jumped up and reached for his holster. So much for reconciliation. She hoped Elvis would come racing after her and apologize, but he didn't. The muzak mocked her as she rode the elevator down, but as she walked out to the street, at least she had one consolation. She had walked out on Elvis Presley. Joyce hadn't even gotten on the plane to Washington when Elvis searched for the scrap of paper with Barbara Lee's phone number. He couldn't get her out of his mind. Tall with dark hazel eyes and high Indian cheekbones, she not only had the smoldering brunette sensuality that Elvis loved, but she was also a Southerner who had come up hard. Born Barbara Kish in Ringgold, Georgia, she spent her early years in a children's home before marrying, moving to Chattanooga, Tennessee, and having her son, Jerry. When the marriage collapsed, she fought her way to Los Angeles, where she didn't know a soul. Elvis felt at home with Southern women, and he had talked with her long enough that first night to see that wounded streak in her. That appealed to him too, and Barbara could tell that it had. I do believe he liked my vulnerability, as my image might have been something more sexy and alluring. In reality, I was just a country girl struggling to survive and accept what life brought me, both good and bad. The next evening, as she was walking into her apartment in Hancock Park, The phone was ringing. She and James had driven from the airport to a beach party in Malibu, and she was late getting home. She knew it was Elvis. "I've been calling you for days, darling," she heard in the familiar voice. "Where you been?" "Oh, Elvis," she laughed. "I've only been gone for a day." "Yeah, well, it feels like you've been gone for days." His voice was teasing, sexy. Then he turned serious. "I'd like to see you again. When can you come back?" She was in the middle of shooting a film, Pretty Maids All in a Row, with Rock Hudson. She couldn't get away for a week. Still, he persisted. What about the weekend? She had plans with James, but she didn't want to tell him that. Finally, they settled on Thursday, but she'd have to be back Friday. When Joe picked her up at the airport, he informed her that she couldn't attend the first show. Jim Aubrey was there with actress Joanne Flug. Barbara had no right to be angry. She was doing the same thing he was, but she was still fuming when Joe took her to the suite Elvis kept specifically for his ladies-in-waiting, which had a round pink bed atop deep pink carpeting. She assumed it was a dais of seduction, but Elvis would make love to her in his own suite, where all his stuff was. He needed to be around his medications and his books and the boys. Until then, she cooled her heels, watched TV, called her answering service, thought about what she was doing there, and tried to shore up her flagging spirits. Finally, Charlie Hodge arrived and escorted her upstairs to the penthouse. Elvis took her hands and kissed her softly yet quickly. I melted. She was surprised to find that the entourage never disappeared, and that the suite was filled with gorgeous women, all competing for Elvis's affections. Since Elvis had invited her there, Barbara didn't think she should have to do the same, but he had distinct expectations. Elvis wanted a woman's undivided attention. He wanted his woman to wait on him and take care of him and be right there next to him. One had to ask permission to go to the bathroom because he wanted to know where his woman was at all times. She leveled with him that she didn't appreciate all the other girls around, that it was exhausting and a little demeaning. He said he understood, but she also knew that she had to either accept it or leave, and it was a difficult toss of the coin. At 3 a.m., he took her to his bedroom, and this time the pajamas were red, not black, and offered instead of thrown. They carried the vague scent of what Barbara thought was Old Spice. He showed her to the guest bathroom, and then retired to his, and when she came out, he was waiting for her. She sat at the foot of the mammoth bed, and then Elvis held out a surprise for her. "I'd like you to have this," he said, producing a gold medallion of Jesus. A Jesus charm might have been a mood killer for a dazzling actress who had come to Las Vegas to spend the night with rock's reigning sex god, but Barbara had relied on faith to get her through the worst of her childhood, and now Elvis was sharing a part of his. God, Jesus, the Bible became the basis for their relationship. In time, they would get down on their knees and pray together, and the most vulnerable she ever saw him was when he was on his bed reading scripture and talking about what God meant to him. But in just that moment, a tear came to her eye, and she leaned over and kissed him. That first night, the kissing was the foreplay. His mouth was round, full, and soft. But during lovemaking, he reminded her a bit of his character from Jailhouse Rock. He kissed her over and over, eventually finding his way to the back of her neck. It sent chills through her. Then he kissed his way downward, touching and kissing her breasts, and working his way down her arm to the back of her hand. There, he briefly stopped, and they both broke out in laughter. He grabbed her again, and then they kissed harder, more passionately, almost frantically. He was spontaneous, hungry, and made love with the enthusiasm of a teenager. It was a dream to be with him, to kiss him, to smell him, to taste him, and finally to feel him inside of me. An hour later, they made love again, and then he started asking her about numerology. Did she know what it was? She didn't have a clue, she told him. "Good," Elvis said, smiling. "When the pupil is ready, the teacher is willing." Eventually, they read all kinds of spiritual texts together, including Ram Dass's 1971 book, Be Here Now. "He was an old soul," she says. "I loved spending private time with him. because that is when you saw the real Elvis. Yet in many ways, she held herself back with him. I loved him with all my heart and soul, but didn't fall in love with him because I really wanted to be with Jim Aubrey. But Elvis was a gift, something good that happened to me. From the beginning, he knew about her son, Jerry, who was 6 years old. He knew, too, that Barbara had given birth to him, that she was a mother. Yet, it never stopped him from wanting to make love with me or be with me. If one doesn't talk about something, then one forgets it exists. And in my case, we didn't talk about my son. Nor did he mention Lisa Marie, because I understood what he wanted, and a part of that was fantasy. Having children brings reality into any given situation. The only time Barbara was aware of Priscilla was when she saw her things in the bathroom at the Truesdale home. But he did talk of Anne Margaret, mostly in the sense of how jealous he was of Roger Smith. Even though he had chosen Priscilla over the sensuous redhead, it took him a long time to forget Anne Margaret, as Anne had moved on. When he spoke of her, I could tell it hurt his feelings. Elvis and Barbara would see each other off and on for 2 years and keep their affair secret from almost everyone. Elvis bought her a brown 250C Mercedes, gave her guns so she could keep herself safe, and adorned her with beautiful clothes and jewelry. I loved my little brown Mercedes, but Elvis was the most excited because he truly loved to give. He loved surprising you when you least expected it. Unlike Joyce Bova, she knew Elvis had a girl for most every night and every occasion. But why not? He was the king. I can't blame him. It kept his stories fresh. And he loved all women, really. He appreciated us all. Their relationship was unique for both of them. Soon she would be juggling not just Elvis and James, but also Steve McQueen, with whom she would make the 1972 film Junior Bonner. Elvis never asked her to stop seeing other men, and Barbara was the only woman from whom Elvis tolerated such behavior, otherwise insisting on complete faithfulness. He took pride in stealing James Aubrey's girlfriend, but he couldn't stand the idea of Barbara being with McQueen, whom he otherwise admired, as he did Aubrey. Elvis called McQueen that motorcycle hick, the tough guy actor returning the barb with that guitar hick. "What's ironic," she says, "is that all 3 of us were hicks, and I mean that in the most affectionate way." On September 9th, 1970, Elvis began a pilot tour of 6 cities: Phoenix, St. Louis, Detroit, Miami Beach, Tampa, and Mobile, to resume his live concerts. With all tickets selling out within hours of going on sale, netting Elvis nearly $175,000 for 6 nights of work, he knew his rock and roll caravan would be on the move for some time. He was healthy, trim, and sexy, though his sideburns had grown into such huge mutton chops that they threatened to envelop his face. The Colonel advanced the dates, going into each city the day before, and the old gang came back to do their jobs. Joe in overall command, Charlie stage managing with scarves and water at hand, Lamar running lights, Richard handling wardrobe, and Sonny heading up security. Dr. Nick was now on the payroll as tour physician. On the first night, Elvis met an attractive, long-haired brunette named Sherry Williams, who turned 18 in his hotel room after the show. She lived in L.A., but she had a friend who had met Elvis before and wanted someone to make the trip to Arizona with her. Sherry was actually more of a Beatles girl, but she knew Elvis was interested in her because he would be talking to someone and glancing at me out of the corner of his eye. I could tell then that there was some kind of connection. Before the evening was over, Jerry slipped her a card with Elvis's contact number on it. But she never called it. Elvis was 36 and nearly twice her age, and it just didn't feel right. Then, a month later, Charlie called her friend and invited her to Palm Springs, asking her to bring along the girl from the Phoenix show. Sherry spent a few days there, sleeping on the couch, and then went back later in the fall and winter. As a teenager, she was confused about it all and felt overwhelmed on her visits. Charlie and Joe were nice to her, but the rest of the guys intimidated her. She'd had no male role models in her life and didn't really know how to act around men that age. Then she tried talking to Ricky Stanley, because he was more of a peer. But she later learned that Elvis didn't like any of the entourage, not even his stepbrother, talking with his girlfriends. It wasn't allowed. He wanted all her attention. It was a very complex relationship. He was a lot of things to me. A friend, a brother, a father. He wasn't a lover yet, but he filled a lot of shoes. He and I talked about that a lot. Late in the fall of 1970, perhaps spurred by the threats in Las Vegas, Elvis's obsession with law enforcement took a pathological turn. In Denver that November, he spent more time talking with the off-duty policemen assigned to protect him than he did with his entourage and band. He made lifelong friends of detectives Ron Pietrafesco and Jerry Kennedy, who, at his request, got him his own blue policeman's uniform. Like many collectors, he wasn't content with just simply reaching a certain level, and each time he obtained a long-desired badge, he was already in pursuit of the next one. He talked his pals on the Denver police force out of an honorary shield, and then a real one, just as he had Shelby County Sheriff Roy Nixon back in Memphis. He was especially intent on acquiring Sheriff Nixon's official deputy badge, as it permitted him to lawfully carry a pistol. But after seeing a Federal Bureau of Narcotics and Dangerous Drugs, BNDD, badge that belonged to John O'Grady's friend, Paul Freese, no other badge would do. Sooner or later, he would have one. Offstage, his dress was beginning to reflect his compulsion. Not only did he actually wear the Denver police uniform on occasion, but when Regis Wilson's brother, Jim, joined Elvis's crowd at the Memphian one night, he was shocked to see that Elvis had on a jumpsuit with guns in a holster, like a cowboy would wear. And that December, as best man at Sonny and Judy West's wedding, he festooned his black velvet bell-bottomed suit with a large belt with gold eagles and chains. Then he strapped on an additional belt with a large gold buckle and a sheriff's star, as well as his own official deputy badge that Sheriff Nixon had just given him. To that, he added 2 guns and a regulation police shoulder holster. Finally, he stuck a pair of pearl-handled pistols in his waistband and a Derringer in his boot. To complete his look, he carried a 15-inch Kel-Lite flashlight. Before they went into the church, Marty practically had to wrestle it from his hands. It was daylight. He didn't need a flashlight to see. But the black metal Kel was official police issue. "God damn," he cursed. "I hate to give this up." Even without it, says Marty, he was a strange sight. His hair long and curled up in the back, his black suit set off by a white tie, his eyes covered with amber glasses. I'll bet he was the only best man in the history of Memphis to go to the altar with 5 guns on him just to stand up for a groom. Each badge seemed to spawn another gun-buying spree, and his desire for firearms and all their accoutrements. He had customized gold handles made for his Colt and Beretta pistols, seemed to know no end. Marty called it his super spy period. The customizing of things also became another obsession, though he had always liked seeing his initials on things, starting with the rifle he got as a boy. It was an aggrandizement that spoke to his vanity, just as he could never pass a mirror without stopping to check himself out. He just had to make sure he was still the king, says Barbara Lee. Around this same time, he started incorporating EP into 14-karat gold, goggle-shaped eyeglasses designed by Dennis Roberts and made up to his prescription at Roberts's Optique Boutique on Sunset Boulevard. But that wasn't enough. He wanted something uniquely Elvis, not just for himself, but also for the guys. Something that showed they were a group, his group, exclusive and powerful. He was on a flight with Priscilla one day when together they began sketching out the design for a 14-karat gold charm with the letters TCB laid atop a zigzag lightning bolt. Taking care of business in a flash. He took the design to Schwartz and Abelser Jewelers in Beverly Hills to be made into pendants, and that fall, he picked up the first 24 on gold chains. In time, he would add TLC, or Tender Loving Care, pendants for the ladies. Patty Perry would treasure hers like nothing else. My TLC has never been off my neck since he gave it to me. I clean it and I had it reinforced, but it's going with me, you know? Soon, the TCB symbol would appear on his eyeglasses, too. On December 19th, 1970, Vernon sat out in his office at Graceland, tallying up his son's recent expenses, and then walked in the house to take Elvis to task. On top of all the guns and jewelry and the 10 Mercedes he had bought as gifts, including one for Vernon himself, Elvis had offered to pay for Sonny's wedding. Vernon told him it had to stop. They had a terrific fight, Priscilla joining in to support her father-in-law's point of view. Elvis didn't feel well. He was taking penicillin for an eye infection, and now outraged that the very people who lived large off his money would try to dictate how he spent it, he stormed out of the house and sped off, ending up at the airport. There, he did something he had never done before in his life. He boarded a commercial airliner by himself and left the city without anyone knowing where he was or where he was going. Though he hadn't seen Joyce Bova since August, when she slammed the door on the penthouse suite in Vegas, Elvis decided he had to see her and her twin, Janice. He wasn't sure why exactly, but unconsciously he seemed to feel Joyce was the only one who could sympathize with his plight and offer relief. There are 2 reasons for Elvis to hunger for that sort of connectivity with the twinned twins, says Peter O. Whitmer. First, there are psychological phenomena so odd to a singleton that only another twin would understand with unconditional regard and agreement. Second, it undoubtedly transported him back to an emotional state that was far more static than the one he was actually in. An easy analogy conjures 3 survivors reunited after a terrible accident. If 2 were still a pair, and the third had lost his other in the tragedy, no one could understand that phenomenon better. For Elvis, going to see Joyce was a temporary fix, a Band-Aid, that must have soothed him from the inside out, in Whitmer's view. To even envision any kind of reunion with them might have been the most healing phenomenon ever for him. Yet, as they were the united ones, he was still somewhat an outsider to them, ever to remain so. When his plane landed in the nation's capital, Elvis arranged for Liberty limousine service to take him to the Hotel Washington, where he registered as John Burroughs, using his own address in Memphis. However, he had thrown away Joyce's telephone number after their altercation at the International that night, and now he didn't know how to find her, either at home or at work, through government listings. Realizing he had no way to locate her alone, he couldn't take care of himself, so I don't know how he got here on an airplane, Joyce says. He checked out of the hotel and went back to the airport. There, he booked a flight to Dallas, where his stewardess was based. But in arranging for his ticket, he got into a hassle with the agent, who noticed his gun and followed him on the plane and demanded he hand it over. Elvis refused to give up his weapon. Embarrassed, he got up and left, only to have the pilot come apologize and invite him back on the plane. In Dallas, he discovered that his girlfriend was apparently out on a flight. Now flummoxed and hungry, but uncomfortable going into a restaurant by himself, he dialed Jerry about midnight in Los Angeles. Jerry was working at Paramount as a film editor, and Elvis woke him up. "Jerry," Elvis said, "I'm coming into Los Angeles." His friend was half asleep and didn't know who it was, partly because it was that unusual to hear his voice on the phone, since there were always people to do those things for him. "Jerry," he said again, "it's me. I'm going to be in Los Angeles at 2 a.m. Get a car, call Gerald, and meet me at the airport." Still groggy, Jerry said fine and wrote down the TWA flight number. Before they hung up, Elvis cautioned Jerry to tell no one where he was. He wanted Vernon and Priscilla to sweat a little. Gerald Peters, Elvis's new limo driver, swung by Jerry's apartment and on the way arranged permission to drive out to the plane. When Elvis walked off, Jerry could see he was really prepared. He came down the steps with a little cardboard box. I said, "What is that?" He said, "Well, I had to get some stuff for traveling." He had toothpaste, a toothbrush, a bar of soap, and a little wash rag. Once they got in the light, Jerry noticed that Elvis's face was all swollen up, and he was in really bad shape. He had a rash on his face and neck, worsened by the chocolate he ate on the flight. "Elvis, what happened?" "I got a real bad reaction to penicillin," he answered. "Let's call a doctor right away." While Jerry was on the phone arranging for a physician's house call at 2:30 a.m., Elvis started chatting up a flight attendant and then said they had a stop to make. "Jerry, we got to take her by her place." "Okay," Jerry said, shaking his head. "But I got a doctor up there on Hillcrest for you." Suddenly, the stewardess was more important than Elvis's ailment. It was one of those real cold, misty nights, as Jerry remembers. But even after they got the girl home, they sat in the car for an hour so Elvis could talk to his date. The doctor stayed all night monitoring his patient, so Jerry stayed up too. The next morning, Elvis was much improved and announced they were going to Washington. He didn't tell me why he wanted to go, and I didn't ask him. But Elvis needed Jerry to help him find Joyce. He also wanted to see about getting a narcotics agent badge, like Paul Freese's. Gerald drove them to the Beverly Hills Hotel, where Elvis cashed a check for $500. Then they boarded a nonstop flight from LAX to Washington National that would get them in about 6 a.m. The airline boarded them first, and then the rest came on. A heavy Christmas crowd, guys in uniform from Vietnam on the way home for the holiday, as Jerry remembers. One soldier stopped and shook hands with Elvis, and then the two started up a conversation. Suddenly, Jerry felt Elvis nudging him in the side. "Where's that money?" "I got it. It's safe." "Give it to me." "Elvis, this is our expense money." "Jerry, he's going home for Christmas." "Yes, but we won't have any money for tips." Elvis looked deflated. The guy just got back from Vietnam. So Jerry reached in his pocket, and Elvis handed the soldier the money and wished him a Merry Christmas. Later in the flight, Elvis told Jerry he intended to see Deputy Director John Finlater, who was John O'Grady's contact at the Bureau of Narcotics and Dangerous Drugs. He wanted that badge, and he wanted it bad. And then, flying through the clouds, Elvis had another idea. He would write a letter to President Richard Nixon. Woozy-eyed and shaky, using the pull-down tray as a desk, he told the president that he was writing in his capacity as a concerned American and that he had met Vice President Spiro Agnew in Palm Springs only several weeks before and expressed his fears for the country. As he wrote the president, he was especially concerned about such subversive elements as the hippies, the drug culture, the Black Panthers, and the Students for a Democratic Society. However, such groups do not consider me as their enemy, or as they call it, the establishment, he wrote. He knew so because he had done an in-depth study of drug abuse and communist brainwashing techniques, and I am right in the middle of the whole thing where I can and will do the most good. All he needed, he said, was for the president to make him a federal agent at large, and he would stay in Washington as long as it took. The irony, Jerry says, is that Elvis felt a certain amount of responsibility for the way drugs were taking over the music business, and he wanted to do something positive. He never said he wanted to be a narc. His thinking was that if he were talking with someone in the entertainment field and he knew it was a bad drug situation, he wanted to scare them out of that type of environment without busting them. He liked to have credentials, and he wanted to be able to show them a badge. "I would love to meet you just to say hello, if you're not too busy," Elvis told the president at the close of his letter. Then, as soon as they landed, penniless in Washington, Elvis insisted on dropping off his missive at the White House gates. It was 6:30 a.m. Elvis then had the limousine service take them to the Hotel Washington to await Nixon's call. Later that day, Joyce Bova was sitting at her desk looking over the Naval Court of Inquiry on the Pueblo incident. Her phone buzzed. "My name is Jerry Schilling," said the voice on the other end. "I'm a friend of Elvis Presley." She was too astonished to say anything. "It's because of Elvis that I'm calling. In fact, he's here in Washington, and he wants to see you." Put Elvis on the phone." He was contrite now and told her he hadn't been himself that night she walked out on him. He came to Washington, he said, to ask her to forgive him. She wasn't even sure what to say. "How did you find me here anyway? I never gave you this number." "It wasn't easy. I had Schilling here, calling all over Congress looking for you." Then he went through the whole thing, how he'd been there a few days before, then went on to California. But he'd tell her about all that later. Right now, all he wanted to do was find out where to send the car. And honey, bring your sister. From then on, Elvis always wanted my sister to come see him too. He was acutely aware of our closeness and understood that thing between twins and wanted it so badly himself. He always made her feel welcome anytime, anywhere, which was one of the qualities that was so precious about him and very important to me. By the time Joyce and Janice saw Elvis at the hotel that night, Sonny West had joined him, and Elvis had another story to tell. Outrageously dressed in his best Vegas Does DC outfit, a velvet coat topping a black suede suit, a massive gold belt given to him by the International, glittering chains circling his neck, tinted sunglasses, and a cane. He got his meeting with the president in the Oval Office. He also came away with the promise of his cherished badge. John Finlater turned him down, but the president, who later said how much he had liked his visitor, wanted him to have it. In a bizarre way, Elvis and Nixon hit it off. When the White House photographer was setting up his equipment, Nixon looked at Elvis and gave him a poke. "You dress kind of strange, don't you?" "Well, Mr. President," Elvis said with a smile, "you got your show and I got mine." Later that evening, Elvis and Sonny drove Joyce home in the limo. She gathered her things and returned with him to the hotel. It was December 21st, 1970, the first time she spent the night with Elvis Presley. "You're a beautiful woman, and you're a pure little girl too, aren't you?" he said sweetly. They were sitting on the edge of the bed, and she was wearing a flimsy nightgown. She put her fingers to his lips. "Joyce, I know this is new for you, but it's right, believe me." Her stomach was in knots. He'd had a very big day. He'd met the president, and soon he would have a really cool new badge. It was no time to disillusion him with confessions. 30. A Prince from Another Planet. For his 36th birthday, Elvis tricked out his new light blue Mercedes with all manner of law enforcement gear. A police radio, a revolving blue light, chemical weapons, and handcuffs. Then he spent the next few days buying $3,500 worth of additional guns and police equipment. If he couldn't be an officer, at least he could play cop. In D.C., he'd had the limo driver pull over at the scene of a terrible accident one night on the rain-slicked Baltimore-Washington Parkway. Someone had hit a car and driven it across 2 lanes, and it ended up a tangled wreck. Inside, an injured woman lay across the front seat. Elvis approached a policeman standing in a rain cape, water pouring down the visor of his cap. "Officer, can I help with anything? I'm Elvis Presley." Joyce was standing behind him and saw the policeman's stunned expression in the glare of his flashlight, his mouth agape, his eyes fixed in a wide-open stare. Before he could finally find the words, Elvis moved on. Now he was kneeling down beside the woman. "Hiya. How you doing?" He tried to sound friendly and calm. The woman was dazed, but whether it was from the accident or who she saw crouched in front of her, Joyce wasn't sure. She saw her mouth moving a bit. "She's trying to say something," Joyce pointed out. "Just relax, ma'am," Elvis said, "and tell me what you need." "Are you really Elvis Presley?" Joyce worried the poor woman thought she had died and gone to heaven. The ambulance was coming now. They could hear the siren and see another policeman waving traffic around. "You're going to be all right," Elvis told her, and then he went on his way. Now he never left Graceland without his blue police light, his long flashlight, a billy club, and at least 2 guns. He'd put on his uniform and go out and stop traffic, pull a guy over, tell him he was driving too fast, and give him a safety lecture, Billy Smith remembers. Elvis may have been impersonating an officer, but he couldn't write anyone a ticket, so he carried a pad to scribble out an autograph and handed it through the car window as if it were a citation. More and more, he saw himself as a patriot and humanitarian, a person put in an extraordinary position to make a difference. especially after the Junior Chamber of Commerce of America honored him as one of the nation's 10 Outstanding Young Men of the Year on January 16, 1971. It put him in the company of past winners Leonard Bernstein, Orson Welles, and the Reverend Jesse Jackson. That night at the awards ceremony at Ellis Auditorium, he would make his famous acceptance speech. "When I was a child, ladies and gentlemen, I was a dreamer." But at the press conference at the prayer breakfast that morning, he took the chance to say what was really on his mind. "I don't go along with music advocating drugs and desecration of the flag. I think an entertainer is for entertaining and to make people happy." Priscilla was by his side that day, and she would come for the opening and close of his Vegas engagement in January and February. But Joyce was there in between. It was the first time they had made love during a time when he was Elvis Presley. She found that his private nature was to be soft and tender, playful and cuddly rather than boldly erotic, but that when she went to bed with the performer, something of the orgiastic frenzy of the crowd came with him. Still, there was some of that sweetness. He was glad to have met Janice the month before, he told Joyce. "I understood that until your twin gave her blessing to us, you wouldn't be able to give yourself to me." But now Elvis had turned Joyce into the Priscilla of old, with the same bouffant hair and the eye makeup, and she was mistaken for her and beseeched for autographs more than ever. As with Priscilla, he also gave her pills to sleep, getting Joyce hooked on Placidils. She was worried about herself, but she was more worried about him, about what all those books were doing to him. "I have a serious message for the world," he told her. "I have powers, Joyce, that I don't go bragging about. I could announce them to the world." "Why don't you?" she asked. "People aren't ready for me to announce that yet." When Elvis started messianic talk like that around Dr. Nick, the physician thought it was more of a game. A conversation piece, something he would do to entertain himself and others. A couple of the guys thought Elvis really believed he could heal people, but Dr. Nick was sometimes there when he'd do the laying on of hands. He'd wink at you like, "I really don't believe in all of this, but I'm going through the motions and saying these things." Whether or not he had powers, he was a master planner at covering his tracks. That January in Vegas, he was particularly adept, bringing Sherry Williams in as soon as Joyce flew out. She spent most of the month of February with him there, where he gave her a TLC pendant. He also shared the A&D ointment he used to keep his lips soft, because we'd kiss so passionately that I'd get the worst razor burn on my cheeks. It hurt so much, but I loved it. He never forced any drugs on her and paid off her car when she refused to let him buy her a new one. He was a huge impact on my life, all positive and fun. Nothing he ever said or did was negative toward me in any way. When still other girls came in, Sherry stayed in his suite on the 29th floor. I had very mixed feelings about it. For a sheltered 18-year-old girl, if it wasn't me, it was going to be someone else, so I rationalized it. At first, she didn't know about the other girls he had there at the same time. She was always told it was Priscilla. I was very naive, but I don't begrudge him for that. If anybody could get away with it, it was Elvis. She would go back in August, and then again when he returned to Vegas the following year. Altogether, she saw more than 50 of his shows. One time, he sang "Just Pretend" and pointed over to her booth. Another time, he sang one of their special songs for her, Buffy Sainte-Marie's "Until It's Time for You to Go," a lover's ballad about an affair that can never grow into a real relationship. He was thinking about Anne Margaret, who was wrestling with her own demons now. Suffering from depression, she was hurtful to her husband and her mother, and her social drinking had slipped into alcoholism. Seeing Elvis at her shows, sitting in the back booth, or coming on stage, doing a knee slide and stopping just at her feet, didn't help. That February 1971, she came into Vegas a few days early for her engagement, and Elvis invited her and Roger to a party at his suite. where he told her to stand perfectly still and then demonstrated karate chops all around her face to show off his prowess. She knew that a mistake of a mere millimeter could kill me, injure me severely at the least, but I trusted him implicitly. Then she felt a breeze as he reeled off several punches. When he finished, he shook his head. "You know, you're crazy," he told her, his voice full of so many emotions. She smiled. "So are you." Before long, he'd accidentally break another guest's ankle with a karate kick and, in the recording studio, send a gun flying out of Red's hand and straight through Chip Young's handmade guitar. In the middle of March, Priscilla flew to California to supervise the continuing redecoration of the Monovale house, while Elvis went to Nashville to meet Felton Jarvis at RCA's Studio B. Felton needed a lot from him this time: a pop album, a holiday LP, a gospel record, and some singles, and hoped they would have a marathon session like last time. But it wasn't to be. He had folk songs on his mind, especially Ewan McCall's "The First Time Ever I Saw Your Face." And at 1:30 a.m., normally a productive time for him, he called off the session. He was having increasing pain in his eye, he said, probably just a flare-up of that infection from December. When it worsened the next day, he called Dr. Nick, who flew in with Dr. David Meyer, an ophthalmologist. Dr. Meyer first treated Elvis at his hotel and then admitted him to Nashville's Baptist Memorial Hospital. His diagnosis? Iritis. Probably a constancy from the dye he used to color his eyelashes, Dr. Nick thought, and secondary glaucoma. Barbara Lee came to visit him, flying in from California and staying in the doctor's quarters when she wasn't lying right in the hospital bed with him. I held his hand while they shot him in the eyeball, but I looked the other way. He was brave and didn't make a peep. The very word glaucoma made him think he was going blind, so Barbara understood when he flew in girlfriends one at a time to stay with him. Later that spring, he invited her to Graceland. She loved sharing that world with him, seeing all his old Memphis hangouts and walking the Graceland grounds. Though he scared her playing chicken on the go-karts with the guys. Like Minnie May, who swore she heard noises coming from Gladys's ghost, and Priscilla, who had sensed Gladys's spirit when she found racks of her clothing in the attic. Barbara perceived Gladys around her, first in the dining room, but even more so upstairs in Elvis's rooms, where her picture stood on a table. I felt her. Her presence was always there. Elvis spoke mostly of her when we were alone in his bedroom. It was there, under the Naugahyde ceiling with the TVs built in above his bed, that he shared most everything with his girlfriends, in his private time away from the boys. He said Gladys had told him he would marry a brown-eyed girl, and that he knew she would have liked me. He handed out Placidils to her for sleep, but she didn't want them and hid some of them in the sofa. One time when they were together, he'd given her a gray pill for a headache, and it made her intensely ill. Joyce, too, visited Graceland that spring, the same day that Barbara went back to California after Elvis's glaucoma scare in Nashville. Joyce came from the opposite end of the country and then flew with him to Memphis. With all the medical equipment now set up in Lisa Marie's room, it was Joyce who held his hand and flinched while Dr. Meyer put the needle in his eye. He was incoherent nearly her whole visit, but the only part that really scared her was the oxygen tank in the room. I couldn't understand why there was an oxygen tank for an eye problem. The doctor showed it to me and I thought, oh my God, I hope I don't have to use this thing. Elvis wore a black patch for a while, smoking marijuana to alleviate the pressure in his eye, and canceled his immediate touring plans. Joyce came back to Tennessee to see him on May 21st, flying again into Nashville, where he was completing a week-long recording session. But he awakened in pain the next day in their hotel room, complaining of stomach cramps, and insisted on flying home to Memphis. They drove straight to Dr. Nick's office from the airport, and suddenly, to Joyce, he was like brand new. At the time, Elvis seemed to be suffering only from irritable bowel syndrome, an uncomfortable intestinal dysfunction that can largely be managed through diet, exercise, and supplements. But it was just the first presentation of a far more serious problem. He had a premorbid condition, a congenital megacolon, or an abnormal enlargement that would soon be revealed as tremendous in size, in Dr. Nick's words, 3 to 4 times normal in diameter. Eventually, the organ would lose much of its nerve innervation and ability to function. He had been an outpatient in Palm Springs earlier that month for his 4th wedding anniversary, and more, Palm Springs would become a place where Elvis threw all caution to the wind. At some point that year, probably that summer, the guys held one of their typical weekend orgies, and one of the female guests later sent a letter to the house addressed to Lizard Tongue. Priscilla found it, went ballistic, Sonny says, and called Joe in Vegas, insisting on talking with Elvis. Joe told her he was asleep, and when Elvis called her back, he turned the tables on her, chewing her out and saying the letter had really been for Sonny, not him. Priscilla apologized and telephoned Sonny's new bride to tell her that her husband was fooling around. During big arguments such as that, Joe saw that he played the tough part. Hey, you don't like it? Here's the door. A couple of times he got in fights with her and some of the later girls and said, you can take your clothes and leave. Elvis was very good about being on the defensive whenever he got in trouble, and he was great when it came to screaming and yelling. It frightened them to the point that they wouldn't say anymore. He had a real bad temper. Priscilla's way of dealing with it all was just to continue building her own life in California with Lisa Marie. She had a new set of friends, and she was taking karate now from Ed Parker. When she was in Memphis, she'd keep up her technique with Kang Ree at his studio on Poplar Avenue, where Elvis studied Taekwondo. Priscilla also continued her dance sessions while in Memphis, frequently at Sally O'Brien's studio behind the Davis YMCA in Whitehaven. Pat West, Red's wife, went with her, Priscilla driving and taking Lisa Marie to play with Sally's daughter, Paige, who was Lisa's same age. Sally considered Priscilla to be a lovely dancer and missed few classes. I found her to be a very warm and kind person. I think she just needed to have some normal time and conversation away from the spotlight. It was normalcy that Priscilla craved the most. Some of her favorite moments with Elvis were the nights when he'd come into Lisa's bedroom. He always called her Yisa, and read her nursery rhymes on the bed. But those times grew fewer and fewer. One night in California, Elvis looked across the living room and realized Priscilla could do quite well without him. "My," he said, "you've grown." And that, Priscilla says, is the moment we both knew the marriage was over. For a while, she remained the token wife, tucked away at home while Elvis indulged himself with a plethora of girlfriends. Finally, she did what she felt she had to do. I took a lover. It was my way out. He was, of course, Mike Stone, the karate champ she and Elvis had seen in Hawaii. The guys knew about her affair before Elvis did. Henrietta, the maid at the Holmby Hills house, told Red that Mike was spending a lot of time there. Then 3-year-old Lisa Marie inadvertently ratted them out. Mike had taken them camping, she told new entourage member James Cawley. And I saw Mommy and Mike wrestling in their sleeping bag on the beach. They wrestled all night. Finally, Sonny caught them in the shower together on Monavale. Nobody really blamed her, especially not Joe. She wanted some real love that she wasn't getting from her husband. She was at home going out with the girls, and then started to take karate with Mike, and boom, it all changed. But Priscilla would wait for the right time to tell her husband that she had chosen another man over him. He was already acting like a man who knew, but even if he didn't, he began moving farther out on the edge, taking bigger chances and demonstrating increasingly reckless regard for his own life. But there were still glimmers that he held out hope. In May, he renewed contact with Day Amada at the Self-Realization Center, and soon he would invite Larry Geller back into the fold. For a short period, he looked into Scientology, the religion founded by L. Ron Hubbard. While he ultimately dismissed Scientology as cultish and money-grubbing, he stayed away from Scientology like it was a cobra, says Lamar. It ultimately brought about his curiosity regarding actress Peggy Lipton. He'd heard she was spiritually curious, and he thought he might connect with her on several levels. He'd loved her cool reserve on the Mod Squad, even as it scared him. Two of Peggy's actress friends, Janet and Shelley, were seeing him at the same time and suggested she meet him, even as they warned her that he was damaged and fragile. Something about him fascinated her. She had idolized him growing up and called him the sacred monster of rock and roll. Joe placed the call, and in July 1971, Elvis got on the phone and invited her to his first engagement at Del Webb Sahara Tahoe at Lake Tahoe, Nevada. He kissed like a god, Lipton wrote in her 2005 memoir, breathing out. But that was about it. He didn't feel like a man next to me, more like a boy who'd never matured. Elvis came for her in a private plane, a Bach 111 twin-engine jet he'd chartered with a full-time pilot to get over his fear of flying. From the moment she stepped aboard, she knew it was a mistake. Sitting in the cabin in full white regalia, complete with sunglasses, rings, and rows of gold chains, Elvis looked like an action figure of himself. He immediately offered her jewelry from a myriad of blue cases, which put her off, as it seemed too practiced. But she accepted a square ring with little diamonds, rubies, and sapphires that you could move around to form any letter. The one he gave her had a P on it, and she didn't know if he meant it for Presley or Peggy. But he was funny and charming, and she was surprised to find him smart and considerably savvy despite his hillbilly ways. All the same, he was just too otherworldly and theatrical. What in hell was she doing there? She'd brought along cocaine to get through it, and after they rolled around on the bed in heavy petting, they made love. Or tried to, she wrote. Elvis knew he was sexy, he just wasn't up to sex. Not that he wasn't built, but with me, at least, he was virtually impotent. When he couldn't consummate it, he became embarrassed and went into the bathroom. I knew he felt badly because he left me a poem scrawled on a torn-off scrap of paper on my pillow. After his show, they tried again, but then they gave up. He had too many drugs in him to perform. And then each morning a doctor came and gave him a shot to help him sleep. He wanted her to have one too, but it scared her. Had I taken the shot, I'm sure I would have either died or passed out for days. These were heavy chemical cocktails, and Elvis was seriously into them. It was then she realized that the prerequisite for being with him was to get as stoned as he was, and all she wanted to do was run. One terrifying night, loaded up on his pharmaceutical escort to slumber, Elvis fell into a heavy stupor and woke up violently, gagging and choking. Peggy pulled him into a sitting position, but he continued to struggle. "Oh my God, I thought he's going to choke to death," Lipton wrote. I punched him firmly on the back and he made a final heave. I frantically turned on the light. He was white as a sheet, but still breathing. In his lap, all over his silk pajamas, was vomit filled with maybe 50 or 75 capsules and pills of every description, along with the contents of last night's meal. At the apex of the crisis, he called for his mother. He sat there like a baby, wailing for her. I cleaned him up and held him until he fell back to sleep, while the sun tried desperately to enter the curtained and darkened bedroom. After that, she quit taking his calls. The way he lived was just too frightening, and besides, she had enough problems trying to curtail her own cocaine use. I wasn't going to be able to save him. Nobody was. There were other close calls about the same time. During the Tahoe engagement, he picked up a teenage girl named Paige Peterson, who sat in the second row with her mother. She wore no makeup and was precisely the sort of non-drinking, non-smoking innocent that Elvis couldn't resist. Sonny brought her backstage, and inexplicably, her mother let her stay with Elvis for much of the engagement. He gave her pills to keep up his hours. One night after the show, he took her to Palm Springs. He was drinking large doses of Vicodin, a narcotic analgesic cough syrup, and serving it to Paige in champagne glasses. She had a headache, and Elvis gave her pills to ease the throb in her temples. That night, they both nearly died. When Sonny found them the next day, the room was freezing and Elvis's breathing was erratic. The Vicodin bottle was almost empty. Boss, snap out of it," Sonny yelled and shook him by the shoulders. "Wake up, Elvis." He made a moaning sound, so Sonny moved on to Paige. She let out a short rasp, but when Sonny shook her, she didn't come to, nor when he slapped her face hard. Charlie called for Dr. George Kaplan, one of Elvis's regular suppliers, who arrived within minutes. A shot of Ritalin brought Elvis around, but Dr. Kaplan made no promises about Paige. At the hospital, she was placed in intensive care. "I told her not to drink that much," Elvis said. His voice sounded guilty, Sonny thought, and he paced the floor and sent a Bible verse to the hospital. The guys called John O'Grady and a contact with the Palm Springs police to keep the cops at bay. They came up with a plan that if she died, Charlie would take the rap. He'd say she was his date and he'd given her the stuff, Marty reports. Colonel Parker went into damage control, getting everybody out of Palm Springs and arranging to pay $10,000 to the ambulance crew for their silence. Elvis picked up Paige's medical bills, but though he talked to her on the phone several times, he didn't want to see her again. Still, she and her mother came to Vegas. "I'm sorry to say that Paige wasn't the same person," Sonny wrote in his memoir, Elvis still taking care of business. "Her personality wasn't as radiant as before." After Elvis's death, the episode would be reported in the addendum papers to the Drug Enforcement Agency's investigation of his addiction. When Joyce attended his Vegas engagement in August, the International Hotel was now the Las Vegas Hilton. She was ticked off not to have been invited to Tahoe. She thought that Elvis was punishing her. She'd overslept on Placidilles when she was at Graceland and raced out for her plane, leaving him alone in bed. But all was forgiven. He had the flu, or at least Vegas throat, and although he'd seen Dr. Sidney Boyer for it, he wanted to be babied. That led to a natural subject, and Joyce inquired about Lisa Marie, and about Priscilla too, and then Elvis uttered the words that stopped her heart. "She's a mama. She does the mothering. A mother is different. Once a woman is a mama, she changes." "I'm not sure I know what you mean." "Well," he said, "when a woman has a child, it's a gift from God. It's God's way of telling her she's not a little girl anymore. She's grown up, you know? Now it's time to be respected and all." Joyce wasn't following it. He didn't respect his wife until she had a baby? No, he didn't mean it that way. He just didn't think a mother should try to be sexy and attract men. "It's just not exciting, and it's not supposed to be," he said frankly. "Trust me on this, Joyce. I know I'm right." He didn't say he had no trouble with Susan Henning, and he didn't say that he was currently involved with Barbara Lee, both of whom had a child at home. But 6 days after Elvis made his declaration, Joyce sat in her doctor's office arranging to abort his child. On September 3rd, 1971, laying on a gurney, she was wheeled down a hospital corridor and into a bright white operating room. Everything was sterile, including the faces of the team that attended her. She felt the chemicals flow through the tubes and then counted back. 100, 99, 98. She never told Elvis a thing. "I was so all-consumed with him I was afraid he would leave me, and I didn't want to jeopardize my relationship with him, no matter what." Within 7 months, she would change her mind. By the time she joined him in Las Vegas in February 1972, much had happened. She had gone on tour with him in November 1971, where she discovered that his drug use escalated to new heights on the road and made him another man. They were in the presidential suite of Philadelphia's Bellevue Stratford Hotel the night of November 8th, when he called her into the bathroom to show her how he kept his voice in shape, cupping running water in his hands and inhaling it through his nose, then violently arcing a geyser out of his mouth into the sink. He laughed when she gave him a hard time about it and left the bathroom. But then he called her back, and when she walked to the door, he was standing before her completely naked, which blew my mind, since it was so out of character for him to show himself that way. He once told the guys, "I don't want these girls to know that I have this hillbilly pecker," referring to the fact that he was uncircumcised, and he was so modest he always slept in pajamas. "Look at this," he said, and took hold of himself with his left hand. "I've seen it before," she said wryly. "Are you feeling all right, Elvis?" "I want you to watch this." Now he pulled his foreskin back and washed himself with soap and water. "Elvis," she said. She couldn't believe he wanted her to witness that and turned on her heel. "I'm going back into the bedroom." "You're not embarrassed, are you, baby? I just want you to know I'm clean." It wasn't that she was embarrassed so much as she was astonished. She knew it was the drugs talking, and she was beginning to get scared. Not of him, really, but for him. Seconds later, there was a loud knock at the door, which further surprised her, since no one had the nerve to disturb Elvis in his bedroom. But Elvis moved to answer it, as if he expected someone, and in walked a total stranger. "Come on in, Doc," Elvis said to the man in the gray suit. He was carrying a black bag and eyed Joyce suspiciously. She asked why Elvis needed a doctor, and he told her it was okay. Then the doctor pulled out a rubber tube and a hypodermic needle. Elvis rolled up the sleeve of his pajama top, and the doctor tied the tube around his arm. "Elvis, what is that? What are you taking?" Joyce was nervous. She'd never seen him do anything like that before. "Just wait," he said. "It's okay." Then the doctor slipped the needle into his vein and slowly pushed the plunger. Joyce turned away, but Elvis said, "And give her one, too." She jerked around just as the physician pulled out the spent syringe. "No, no," she cried. She jumped back a half step. "I don't want a shot of anything." Elvis pleaded with her. She'd feel better. It would help her sleep. They got into it then as the doctor took his leave. He wasn't going to hurt her, he said. She should know that. But what was it, she asked. Did he even know? "All you need to know," he told her, "is that I say it's something you need." As the argument wound down, he asked a favor of her. Would she take the used needle back home and throw it away? He didn't want anyone to find it. When she awoke the next morning, the air conditioner was going full blast, and Elvis was as cold and clammy as the icy winter dawn, his breathing so shallow that the incredibly handsome face seemed almost like a death mask. Joyce saw then that his innocent shots and pills could kill both of them. Certainly he was killing himself. He could be the most charismatic man in the world, like the time he, Joyce, Janice, and Sonny took the limo to Amy Joy's donut shop, an all-night drive-in in a tough part of the district where the local ghetto youth hung out. It was past 9 p.m., and Elvis didn't really eat donuts the way legend has it. But when he saw the sign, it just felt like a familiar thing to do, the way he used to ride around Memphis at night and stop for sacks of Crystal burgers. The limo had barely stopped rolling when at least 20 young black men hurried over, eager to see who could be inside such a vehicle. The situation could have flashed out of control in an instant. With Elvis decked out in ostentatious gold chains and eye-popping rings, trapped in a limo. They were all at their mercy, and the kids could have shaken them all down, even a man as powerfully built as Sonny. The crowd swelled by the second to yells of, "Hey, it's Elvis! Come on, man, that's not... Hey, it's really Elvis!" But Elvis, who had spent his youth surrounded by girls rocking the sides of his Cadillac, took command, climbing from the car and stepping right into the throng. Sonny stood at his side, trying not to let his nervousness show. "What you doing here, man?" one of the youths asked. "Just trying to get a few donuts," Elvis said calmly. Then he leaned down to Ben, the limo driver. "How about going in and getting us 3 dozen? He straightened back up and faced his audience. Joyce and Janice were frozen in their seats, but Elvis knew what to do. "Okay, guys, keep cool, and pay attention now." Slowly, he pulled back his coat to reveal his massive gold belt, gleaming as it caught the reflection from a streetlight. "This here," he told the kids, "was a gift from the International Hotel in Las Vegas for breaking their all-time attendance record." A chorus of oohs and ahs went up from the wide-eyed crowd, some of them moving in to get a closer look. They were pushing against one another now, more excited than before. "This belt says I'm the best," he declared. Then he grabbed the pistol out of his shoulder holster with lightning speed. "And this," he said, turning the gun in his hand, "says I get to keep it." The rough ghetto kids let out a loud laugh. "Sure, man," somebody said. "It's yours. Okay, take it easy." It was a masterly performance, and to close it, Elvis shot a curled lip grin. "That's it, fellas," he said. And now, with Ben back in the car and the donuts on the seat, they sped away. It was Joyce's favorite memory of him, but she didn't know this new Elvis, and he kept asking her to move into Graceland, where she spent his 37th birthday with him, January 8, 1972, Priscilla having told him at Christmas that she was leaving. Now Elvis was finally free to be with Joyce, to really be with her. But the idea of living with him scared her. He was so out of control, and I needed my independence. He really wanted to take over my life, but of course I had no control over his, and I knew there was something wrong with that thinking. She was also disappointed that while he had been very sexual, though intermittently, it didn't last. In February, in Vegas, she realized it was impossible to make a life with him. They came from 2 different worlds, and she didn't want to belong to his anymore. In the ladies' room at the hotel, 2 hookers who told her they counted Elvis as a customer had just mistaken her for one of their own. Now she just had to get away from it all. The clothes and hair that weren't really her, the dependence on Placidils, and being around the man who said that pills helped him get close to the silence, to the resting place of the soul. From the passages that he underlined and noted in the margins of his books, she knew he was trying to find his purpose in life. El, he said, was another name for God. But when he read them aloud to her, it drove me crazy. They didn't make any sense to me. But she did understand that he truly ached for his brother, and he really wanted his brother to guide him from these books. On one of her last nights with him, he was just about to slip away, the pills taking him under, when he mumbled something about not having much time left to get his message out. He was terrified of growing older, worried that it won't be long until I'm 40, and that could be too late. It was already too late for Joyce. One afternoon when she awoke, he was still sleeping. The room was cold, the way he liked it, and she shivered from the chill. She dressed, packed, and finally pulled off the gold ring with the little diamond he had given her when they first met and laid it on the nightstand. Then she kissed his cool cheek and closed his door for the last time. Things were slipping away from him in triplicate now, not just in singles or in pairs. The Colonel had rewritten his management contract to give himself a bigger cut of Elvis's live performances, even as he would soon renegotiate his client's Vegas contract for more money. $130,000 a week for the next 2 engagements, and $150,000 a week for the following 3. And Priscilla, in town for the close of his run that February 23, 1972, had something she wanted to formalize with him, too. In between shows, she told him she was involved with Mike Stone. He already knew for certain now, knew it when he sent Red down to the hotel's Italian restaurant to bring her up to the suite. But hearing it from her own lips outraged him. He told her she was crazy, that she had everything a woman could want. But she didn't back down. In fact, She wanted a divorce. Elvis had Sherry Williams in town for consolation, but he'd had 2 women walk out of his life within a matter of hours, and now he did the unimaginable. He raped his wife. Priscilla never termed it rape, but she told Red's wife, Pat, that Elvis forced her to have sex. As she wrote in her memoir, Elvis and Me, he grabbed me and forcefully made love to me. It was uncomfortable and unlike any other time he'd ever made love to me before, and he explained, this is how a real man makes love to his woman. After the second show, he called all the guys in and said, another man has taken my wife. He was seething, but a river of sadness ran through him too. When somebody said, I thought you wanted to get rid of her, his voice was shaky. Not that way, man. It wasn't so much that she was having an affair, Sonny says. It was that she was going to actually leave him for Mike. If Elvis hadn't known Stone, it wouldn't have been as bad for him. Elvis was very upset about the divorce, seconds Joe. Here he is, the sex symbol of the world, and he's losing his wife to another man. It was really an ego killer for him. He wouldn't admit that to us, but we all knew it was hurting him, and he was affected tremendously by it. He found solace with Barbara Lee, who listened as he cursed Priscilla and Mike on a daily basis, since no one leaves the king. But that was good. It helped him process the hurt and the embarrassment of being left. When Marty went out to California on business in March, Elvis was still coming to grips with it. He said he had a problem, that Priscilla was leaving him. He'd just been to the Monovale house and found she had moved out. I'm sorry, man, Marty said. What am I going to do? Let me ask you a question. Are you going to change? Hell no. I ain't doing that for nobody. For his next recording session later in March, he chose songs of heartbreak and regret, Separate Ways and Always on My Mind. He poured himself into his work, including a second documentary film, Elvis on Tour. After a period in the early 1970s in which he lost his discipline in some of the Vegas shows, lying down on stage and talking into the mic and laughing, Joe Macheo remembers, Elvis revitalized himself for the 15-city tour and filming. A young Martin Scorsese supervised the montage editing. While Elvis on Tour would share a Golden Globe Award with Walls of Fire as the best feature documentary, some critics believed it lifted no veils on Elvis's private life. But a posthumous theatrical release, This Is Elvis, contained footage which was originally shot for the earlier documentary. When Elvis is asked in the limousine if he saw the Apollo 16 rocket launch, he implies he was too busy to see it. I was buried in a beaver. And in a later scene from Greensboro, North Carolina, Elvis references another sexual episode to Jerry. You know that girl I was with last night? The dog? Oh man, Elvis says. She gave great head, boy. Hey Joe, that chick last night gave the greatest head I ever had in my life. The last line was later overdubbed for a TV and home video version, euphemistically becoming, could raise the dead. Bragging about cunnilingus and fellatio may have simply been a cover-up for what was really going on with him. He loved cuddling and petting more than he did the actual sex anyway, one woman noted, but when the drugs entered the picture, they took over his body and his sex drive took a nosedive too. I saw the changes starting to happen to him in 1972. It was showing as early as that. Despite the early stages of his physical deterioration, Elvis could still summon the full strength of his artistry when the Colonel offered him a challenge. In June 1972, Elvis became the first performer to sell out 4 consecutive shows at Madison Square Garden, grossing $730,000 over 3 days. He had never played New York City before, as the Colonel always believed Elvis appealed more to a rural and small-town fan base than urban sophisticates. Now, Elvis was apprehensive, though he tried not to let it show. When his new opening act, comic Jackie Kahane, was essentially booed off the stage opening night, Elvis went to him in his dressing room. Mr. Kahane, They're animals out there. Don't let them bother you. You go out there tomorrow and you kick ass." When Elvis emerged to the billowing strains of Also Sprach Zarathustra, Joe Gersio remembers, a great roar echoed through the fabled building, and so many flashbulbs went off that the garden was almost lit for a second. The New York Times, in a rave, recognized it as a legendary performance. Chris Chase's review headlined, "A Prince from Another Planet." The writer saw Elvis as a one-of-a-kind talent, a special champion like a Joe Louis, a Joe DiMaggio, someone in whose hands the way a thing is done becomes more important than the thing itself. He stood there at the end, his arms stretched out, the great gold cloak giving him wings, the only one in his class. 31. Button. The success of the Madison Square Garden engagement buoyed Elvis for a time, but he was still shaken by the divorce. On July 26, 1972, Elvis and Priscilla legally separated, and the world at large learned about Mike Stone. Elvis's lawyer, E. Gregory Hookstratton, drew up the papers and worked out the terms of the settlement, which Priscilla readily accepted, a lump sum of $100,000 plus $1,000 per month for her own expenses and $500 child support. Even though she would reopen the divorce in 1973, seeking more money, they would still walk out of divorce court arm in arm and remain close, in part for Lisa's sake. "It was like we were never divorced. Elvis and I still hugged each other, still had love. We would say, 'Mommy said this and Daddy said that.' That helped Lisa to feel stable. There was never any arguing or bitterness." Elvis recklessly roared around town on his motorcycle, looking terrible, his face unnaturally round and seeming distorted. 20-year-old Mary Kathleen, Kathy Self, an exotic dancer and singer at the Whirlaway Club, and another Priscilla look-alike, was often seen on the back of his Harley-Davidson, her hands around his waist. On June 30th, the Commercial Appeal photographed them at the corner of South Parkway and Highway 51 South, which had been renamed Elvis Presley Boulevard a year earlier. Her mother saw the picture and reprimanded her daughter for dating a married man, later learning that Elvis and Priscilla were separated. But in less than a month, it was all over. Just before 3 o'clock on the morning of July 18, 1972, Kathy, whose father, E.B. Self, was the deputy fire chief, was killed in a single-car accident when her vehicle struck a cement pillar on eastbound I-240 near Elvis Presley Boulevard. She was alone in the car. The press scimitar assumed she was driving home from work, but perhaps she was en route elsewhere. There was a real nice spray of flowers at her funeral from the Presley family. Her mother, Peggy Self Cannon, told the paper in 2000. And there was a huge orchid at the funeral. I always felt it came from Elvis. Earlier that month, Elvis had begun seeing 22-year-old Linda Thompson. She would become not only the most important of his post-divorce girlfriends, but he would also build a stronger and deeper bond with her than he'd ever had with Priscilla. She was his best hope yet for a long-lasting and meaningful relationship with a woman. Predictably, Linda was the winner of a Beauty Queen title, Miss Tennessee Universe, representing the state in the Miss Universe pageant. But she did not precisely fall in line with his ideal type, despite her brown eyes. At 5'9", she was tall, not petite, and refused to darken her long, blondish mane to make Elvis happy. Like Joyce Bova and June Wanico before her, she was an independent thinker. Furthermore, she was educated, having attended Memphis State. But she was a virgin. Most of all, she would nurture him, seeing that Elvis needed more love and care than anybody I ever met, probably more than anyone in this world, because of who he was and what he had done. She found him intensely lonely at heart. One day, Linda was having lunch at a Memphis restaurant with Jean LeMay, a former Miss Rhode Island, USA, who had shared a hotel room with Linda at the Miss USA pageant in Puerto Rico. They had become instant friends, and after the pageant, Jean moved to Memphis to live with Linda, the two thinking they might become flight attendants together. That day at lunch, Linda ran into an acquaintance, Bill Browder, who worked in record promotion and would later become a country singer known as T.G. Shepherd. He invited the two of them to Elvis's movie marathon at the Memphian that night, July 6th. I thought Elvis was still married, Linda remembers, so I didn't have any kind of designs on him, but I found out he wasn't when I got to the theater. It was George Klein who actually introduced the two. Elvis appreciated her Southern girl beauty and personality, as well as her sense of humor, and asked her to come back the following night. When Linda then left for 3 weeks on a family vacation, Elvis turned to another Memphis belle, Sybil Shepherd, the 1966 Miss Teenage Memphis and later the National Model of the Year. Sybil had just made a terrific splash as J.C. Farrow, the small-town Texas temptress in Peter Bogdanovich's The Last Picture Show. Elvis didn't know the classically beautiful 23-year-old was involved with the older director and that she had broken up his marriage. But her provocative scenes in the film reminded him of his sexual awakening with real-life Texas beauties on the hayride. He had George call her when she was home from New York, and they followed the usual M.O. Would Sybil like to come to the Memphian? I said, well, I'll come and meet him, but I want to bring my best friend and my brother and his best friend. When they arrived, Elvis wasn't there yet, and she tried to concentrate on the movie until he made his grand entrance, everybody to the right of her getting up and moving one seat down. He was still looking fabulous, and he smelled great. They dated a month, and if he had smelled bad, it probably would have ended sooner. Things got rolling when he invited her to Graceland for chicken fried steak, a meal after J.C.'s heart. Just as Elvis and Priscilla had fallen in love with myths, he and Sybil were attracted to each other for all the wrong reasons. He was entranced with the celluloid image that reminded him of his youth, and she had grown up in Memphis hoping to catch sight of the hometown boy who became a god. If Sybil had been interested enough in Elvis, Linda Thompson might never have been anything but a 2-night date. But Sybil, though 14 years Elvis's junior, ran in far more sophisticated circles, and as with Peggy Lipton, it doomed them from the start. Still, they gave it a try. But like so many women before her, Sybil found his lifestyle stultifying. In her autobiography, Sybil Disobedience, she described a weekend in Palm Springs. The house was luxurious in a rental sort of way, sprawling and devoid of personal taste. Everything had a metallic glow. All the king's men spent the afternoon competing to see who could make the biggest splash into a murky swimming pool. The guys raced dune buggies 3 or 4 abreast while shouting into walkie-talkies, or sat around a long table with a thick top of beveled glass, eating their favorite deep-fried sandwiches. Today, she sees that she and Elvis actually had a lot in common, that fame and beauty can cause you to be emotionally underdeveloped. People do things for you. There were a lot of times where I just didn't get a chance to grow and learn. But in 1972, she simply couldn't get over the control. Elvis wanted to take her shopping. He didn't like her jeans and tie-dyed mirrored vest, and he demanded she ditch Bogdanovich, who continued to pursue her. She chose to be with Peter, and when Elvis showed up on an unexpected late-night visit, I don't think it had sunk in that I had already ended it. What finished them was the drugs. In a replay of Joyce Bova's experience, Elvis insisted that Sybil join him in his nightly ritual of sleeping medication. He said, "Here, take these," and he had pills in his hands. I said, "Aren't you going to take some of them?" And he said, "Well, I've already had mine." He was almost already asleep, and I went and flushed them down the toilet, returned his emerald and diamond ring, and just said, "Thank you, but I can't." Though brief, their sex life ran the gamut. In an interview with E! Television, she labeled him a wonderful lover, very sexy, but later spoke of his bumbling technique. Let's put it this way. I think before I met him, he was sexually conservative, trapped in a stupid macho thing. Her much-quoted declaration that it was she who taught him oral sex brought hoots of derision from other of his lovers, who knew that by the time Sybil arrived, it was just a shuttle. One came in the door as another was flown back to Vegas. That's precisely what happened when Elvis opened there on July 31st, 1972. During his 3 days of rehearsals, he flew Linda to Los Angeles and then brought her to the Hilton for most of his engagement. As soon as she left, Sybil came in. The Elvis that I got to know in Memphis was very different than the Elvis that I got to know in Las Vegas. He was unavailable in a way, and then years later, I would find out he had 2 other women there at the same time. Elvis followed Raquel Welch into the Las Vegas Hilton showroom that summer, and she had someone call the Colonel to ask if she could come see the show. He arranged for her to sit in Elvis's booth, and she sat there agog at what she terms his third transformation. Despite costumer Bill Bellew's best intentions, Raquel thought Elvis looked almost like Liberace or one of those apparitions, dressed all in white with rings on every finger. Reviewers noted that he seemed more subdued during his engagement and spent less time interacting with the audience between songs. When Raquel went to his dressing room after the show, he was very sweet, very nice, and he showed me all his jewelry. But he didn't seem to be really happy, and she couldn't get the show out of her mind. He had a whole basket of blue scarves, and he must have thrown 50 of them into the audience. It was so carnival. He was almost like a wind-up toy. His most devoted fans, including Robin Roseanne of San Jose, California, saw him otherwise. Once he was on stage, it was like somebody flipped a switch. Just pure sex energy filled that showroom. Robin had been attending all of Elvis's Vegas engagements since 1970, and in 1972, he gave her the first of 8 kisses and 13 scarves she would receive over 72 shows and 6.5 years. Elvis was like a drug, she says. Once you saw him, you had to see him again. She earned that first kiss by holding up an "I want your body" bumper sticker, a promotional item from the health spa where she worked. It caught his attention and lured him over to where she sat at the edge of the stage. He said, "You got it, baby," and I pulled the scarf off from around his neck, and it was hot and sweaty, and he smelled wonderful. I had my ring hand up through his hair, and he was looking in my eyes, and he kissed me with those lips that were like big, soft, warm, puffy pillows. I thought, oh my God, I wonder what this would be like for more than just a split second. He winked at her then and went on to the next song. That's when I realized a couple of his hairs were stuck in my ring. I wrapped them in a tissue and stuck them in my bra, and when I got home, I put them in a Gerber's baby food jar, where they've been ever since. In time, he came to recognize her face, and one year he pointed her out to the crowd and officially dubbed her Rockin' Robin. She felt they knew each other then, and so she grew bolder. One night, she tried to walk her fingers up his jumpsuit, hoping to tweak a hair off of his leg. He just looked at me like, "What are you doing?" Uh-oh, she thought, busted. As a contributor to the book All the King's Things, she became an internationally recognized expert on Presley collectibles and formed a family with other serious fans. Some of them ran to the extreme. I've known women who went to so many Elvis concerts that they got divorced over it. Their husbands said, "It's either me or Elvis," and the women said, "I'll take Elvis." Sex and love was a topic Elvis and Larry Geller discussed many times, particularly with Larry's return to the camp in August 1972. During one engagement, they stepped outside on the balcony of the Hilton about 5 one morning as the sun rose over the desert. They were talking about his struggles and, indirectly, his loneliness and the difference between personal and impersonal love. Elvis looked at me and said, "I want you to put yourself in my shoes. Do you realize I can never know if a woman loves me or Elvis Presley? And trying to be my philosophical self, I said, "Elvis, as far as I am concerned, you have had only one real, true, lasting love in your whole life." He looked at me and he said, "Who?" I said, "The world, your fans." He said, "You're right, man. That's the truth, and that's a heavy price to pay." On September 4th, 1972, Colonel Parker and RCA President Rocco Laganestra held a press conference in Las Vegas to announce Elvis's next big, record-shattering event, Aloha from Hawaii, a live concert to be delivered worldwide in January 1973 by satellite technology. The show, staged in Honolulu with some of the proceeds going to the Kui Lee Cancer Fund, would reach 1.4 billion viewers. But the live label was largely ballyhoo, as both Europe and America would receive a delayed signal. "It's very hard to comprehend," Elvis said, repeating himself over and over, crumpled in a chair at the press briefing. For many who witnessed it, the more perplexing thought was why Elvis's speech was slurred and why he perspired so heavily, wiping his upper lip. His eyes, visible through tinted glasses, seemed dull and dazed. On some days, Elvis appeared clear, lucid, and largely unaffected, but other times, particularly after the divorce action was entered on August 18th, his use of sedatives or downers was obvious to all. One night, a boy came up to Jackie Kahane after a show. "Mr. Katane?" he asked, mispronouncing the comic's name. "Elvis wasn't drunk, was he?" At the time, Lamar Fike reports, Elvis's usual pattern was to take a Valium, a Placidil, a Valmid, some Budabarb, and codeine simultaneously. But now, after a sprained ankle took him to Baptist Memorial Hospital in Memphis that July, he began adding Percodan and liquid Demerol to round out his potent and potentially lethal cocktail. Dr. Nick later learned that he began getting acupuncture 3 times a week with Demerol and Novocaine in California. He felt so good afterward that he just went more and more. Considering the severity of his client's drug use, the colonel might have been expected to speak with Dr. Nick about how to handle it, but he never did. He would ask a direct question at a particular moment when something was happening, but we never sat down and talked about any of Elvis's health problems or what needed to be done. It seemed like his main concern was how many shows we could get in that year. One reason Elvis was excited about the satellite show was what it would say about his potency, particularly to Priscilla, whose approval he still sought and needed. Dr. Nick remembers that he always had tremendous performance anxiety before any of the shows, that he was a basket case. He'd worry whether he was going to be 100% and want something for his nerves, some Ritalin or amphetamines. If he could perform to most of the planet on his own, without any kind of artifice, it would free him. He could boast he didn't need Priscilla, he didn't need drugs, he didn't need anything. He'd even take off his heavy, jeweled cape and throw it in the audience, a symbolic rebirth. Elvis also hoped the Aloha special would impress his new girlfriend. Already he could tell Linda was different from the rest. She was almost always by his side, adored him beyond description, and didn't try to change him, other than to try to temper the drugs. When she went to Dr. Nick and asked him how she could get Elvis off pills, he advised her to simply leave. Instead, she chose to stay. From the outset, she realized he was a paradoxical man, and that theirs would be a complex relationship that would both exceed and fall short of normal expectations. She wanted to give him plenty of room to explore it and make it whatever he wanted. "I think it's wonderful if you can be all things to each other, and he and I were. He called me Mommy, and I was like his mother at times, and he was like my father at times, and we were like children, like brother and sister, and we were like lovers at times. That's a full, rich relationship when you can do that." But her most constant roles were caregiver, nurse, and handholder. The first time he took her to Vegas, Elvis passed out with food in his mouth and started to choke. Linda cleared it out of his throat and turned him on his side to get him breathing again. I felt a responsibility to his mother to take care of him, and actually to the world too, because so many people loved him. She had always felt maternal, and he was like my little boy. Her nickname for him was Bunton, short for Baby Bunting, after the popular nursery rhyme and lullaby. Elvis called her Ariadne, for 3-year-old Ariadne Pennington, a character in his 1962 film Follow That Dream. We both just naturally talked baby talk. That was a big part of our relationship. She was the only girlfriend who truly understood the secret language and used it. A mailgram she sent him when he was away in California demonstrates her prowess. Baby Gullion, you are just a little fella. Little fellas need lots of butch ducklin' and idditream. Grit, chalk, chalk, shake, rattle, roll, hit, hit, punch, bite, hurt, grit, woo! My baby don't care for rings. Pablum Lullian, in or out of the hospital. P.S. Fox you, the poodle, will bite Sooties if you say idditream again. Grit, grit. Signed, Ariadne Pennington. The two rarely fought. Linda even tolerated Elvis seeing other women when she wasn't around, though for the first year and a half he was largely faithful. When he did fool around, it hurt her, Marty Lacker saw. But her attitude was, what am I going to do about it? Say, hey Elvis, you can't do that, or I'm going to leave? He would have said adios. For Christmas that first year, Elvis gave her what all grown-up girls want, a fur coat. And all year round, she gave him what he wanted too. She allowed him to regress to an infantile state, to start the full journey back to Gladys. The irony was that the more childlike Elvis became, the more he treated Lisa Marie as an adult, showering her with the same gifts he gave his girlfriends. The 4-year-old spent Christmas at Graceland that year, and she got a fur coat, just as Linda did. Elvis loved to buy Lisa things, including a big, round bed. It was tacky, fake fur with a round mirror on top and a built-in radio, but he often slept in it when she was with her mother. He'd been thinking a lot about the first girl to whom he gave a round bed, as that September, Anne Margaret tragically fell 22 feet from a platform in Lake Tahoe, breaking her jawbone and shattering her face, arm, and knee. She required extensive reconstructive surgery, but was back performing in Vegas in late November, and Elvis, who had already sent her flowers, went to talk with her. One night, as she and Roger entertained friends in the suite, he dropped by unexpectedly. It was so easy for us to lapse into the closeness we'd always shared, she wrote, and they monopolized each other until it became awkward with the other guests. Late that night, the phone rang in her bedroom while Roger was in the living room next door. She knew who it was before she answered. Elvis started out saying how wonderful she looked, and that his prayers for her health and healing had been answered. Then his tone shifted. He was lonely, he said, and wondered if she would see him. You know I can't, she told him. I know, but I just want you to know that I still feel the same. As the Aloha concert neared in January 1973, Elvis was so pumped up he could have hit the ceiling, Marty says. He worked hard to get in shape, losing 25 pounds on a crash diet consisting of 600 calories a day and what Marty remembers as injections of urine of a pregnant woman. He worked closely with Bill Ballou on the design of what would become his favorite jumpsuit, featuring the American Eagle, and exercised enormous discipline in staying off his drug protocol. Aloha from Hawaii would be his last great triumph. The album would stay on the Billboard charts for 35 weeks and become his first #1 chart-topping LP in 9 years. And many of his old friends came to Honolulu to share the excitement. Felton Jarvis was there, though still weak from an Elvis-financed kidney transplant, and Patty Perry caught a plane at the very last minute. Get over here now, after Elvis looked at a tape of the rehearsal and decided he needed his hair styled. It was a remarkable performance and earned the highest ratings ever in Japan, where it was broadcast live. The feedback, all glowing, boosted Elvis's spirits. The night after the show, he bought diamond and emerald rings for all the wives and gave each of the guys $1,000. He'd stayed straight for 2 weeks now, and everyone prayed that Elvis had turned a corner. But just before he went on, he'd asked for a shot of vitamin B12 mixed with amphetamines. The next morning, they were all supposed to go to the USS Arizona Memorial. Marty banged on his door at the Hawaiian Village Hotel, and nobody answered. Finally, Linda came, and she just made a face and shook her head. Elvis was sitting on the balcony, on the top floor of the hotel, stoned out of his gourd. He was sweating profusely with a towel around his neck, and he could hardly talk. He'd gone right back into it. When the special was broadcast in America on April 4th, 1973, 57% of the television audience watched it, including Joyce Bova. It stirred her emotions, and she called Charlie, just wanting to share the experience with someone close to him. When Elvis himself called back on the hotline, the private phone he'd had installed in her home, her palms began perspiring. But it was a sweet call. "I miss you," he said. "I want you to come to California. Call me in a couple of weeks." She said yes, and for a second she meant it. Before they hung up, he asked for a copy of a photo of himself with both Joyce and Janice taken in Vegas. She sent it, but she didn't call. "I couldn't have gone back to that. I didn't want to. It wasn't good for me." Elvis watched the show with Linda and Jerry, sitting at home in the Monovale house in Los Angeles. But over the next few weeks, Jerry felt as if Elvis were distancing himself from him. The younger man had become infatuated with a girl who was often part of the Palm Springs weekends, and he knew his marriage to Sandy was coming apart. He and Elvis hadn't discussed it. Then, on another trip to Palm Springs, Elvis said, "Jerry, there's something I've got to tell you." Elvis braced himself for a lecture, but instead he got a confession. Elvis had slept with Jerry's girlfriend. It had only been a one-time thing, he said, one night when Jerry had fallen asleep early. Jerry knew he was in no position to be self-righteous, but it stung. Elvis had broken the cardinal rule of the Brotherhood. Soon Jerry's marriage to Sandy collapsed, and he would eventually marry Myrna Smith of the Sweet Inspirations. But that too would unravel. Hanging with Elvis was rough on a marriage. Joe and Joni would be divorced by the end of the year, but Joe soon met a smart and energetic blonde named Shirley Dew, an Oklahoma transplant who had grown up in San Diego. Joe and Shirley were a strong couple, and Elvis told her on numerous occasions how much he admired their relationship. However, one time when she visited him in the hospital, he was half-dressed and got close in her face, and she got the impression that he was coming on to her. She dismissed it and acted as if it hadn't happened. But he was clearer on another occasion in the Imperial Suite in Las Vegas, when they both got up from sleep and ended up in the kitchen at the same time. He put both of his arms up and tried to kiss me, and I just kind of slithered out from underneath him. I said, "I've got to go, Joe's in the room." It was awkward, but I never thought of him in that way, and I never ever accepted any of his advances. I guess if you are really in love with somebody, you don't. That didn't stop Angela Stanley, the 18-year-old wife of Elvis's stepbrother Billy. She went after Elvis like he was the last piece of cake on the platter, according to Billy Smith. Elvis's response was to set Billy Stanley up with another girl so he could be with his wife. Billy wrote about it in his book, Elvis, My Brother, saying the two had a month-long affair in 1972, and that Elvis felt bad about it. Elvis told Billy Smith that he had intentions, but that he never went through with them. He and Angela simply talked, he said, and he ended up preaching to her a little. But Marty Lacker got a different idea one day when he and Elvis walked down the steps into the den from the kitchen, and Billy Stanley happened to pass them. I was thinking about Elvis and Angela, and somehow Elvis knew that. He kind of glanced over at Billy, and then he looked at me and he said, "Well, it ain't like he's my brother." 3 weeks after the Aloha concert, Elvis opened his 8th Vegas engagement. He was tired now. All the Vegas nights of the past seemed to run together. The great shows when he was heralded as the White Knight of Rock. The bad shows when he'd change songs so spontaneously the band could barely keep up. He thought he'd wanted this life so badly, but what had it brought him in the end? Right now, he only knew what it had cost. Sometimes he thought about the night Anita Wood came to see him. She was in Las Vegas with her husband, Johnny Brewer, and ran into Joe and Charlie in the hotel lobby. They invited her to the show, saying they knew that Elvis would want to see her, and they gave her his booth right in front. She took a girlfriend with her. And man, he looked so fine. He talked to me, sang to me. I was just... oh my goodness. She hadn't counted on feeling like that. She went backstage like they'd told her to, and she and Elvis embraced, held on hard and long. "Come on in this room," Elvis said. "Let's go in and talk." It was a little private area with just a bed and chair, and he closed the door to shut out the sound of his father and all the important people he didn't want to see. They talked for about an hour, and the years melted away. Then he looked at her, his face all clouded up and somber. "Little," he said softly, "I wonder if we made a mistake." It was a shattering moment, and Anita fought to hold back tears. But she collected herself. "No," she told him. "It's for the best. We wouldn't have our wonderful children, Elvis." But they would always love each other, they both knew that, and there were things between them no one could ever take away. He wished she would come back again. He'd sat with Cliff Gleaves once, playing records, spinning "Funny How Time Slips Away" over and over. "You know why I'm playing it, Cliff?" he said. "My heart still burns for Anita." On this night in 1973, he didn't care about the present. He only cared about the past. The Hollywood Reporter, in its opening night review, noted his lack of energy and interest and attributed it to illness. The guys knew it ran deeper than the flu. He canceled several of his midnight shows, and even Alex Schufe sympathized with the situation. He didn't have breathing room, you know? It was a continuous thing. I even said to the colonel one time, "Give him a breather, Colonel, gosh. You know he needs a little rest." He said, "Oh, he's young, don't worry, he loves every moment of it." I think he could have let up a little, given him a little more time off. But when 4 South American men jumped up on stage near the end of his show on February 18th, it pushed him over the edge. The men had just been overexuberant fans, and probably drunk, and the guys had quickly wrestled them off. In a dramatic display, Elvis knocked one back into the audience, and then told the stunned crowd, "I'm sorry, ladies and gentlemen. I'm sorry I didn't break his goddamned neck is what I'm sorry about." He was paranoid now, delusional, his behavior drug-induced. In the early hours of the morning, high on pills, he convinced himself that Mike Stone had sent the dark-skinned men to kill him. Climbing the walls, waving guns around, and ranting, "Mike Stone has to die," Elvis ordered Red to arrange a hit on the karate champion. He really felt that way, Joe says. He was the man, the masculine guy who was hurt by his wife, and "I'm gonna kill that son of a bitch." He kept harping on getting it done until finally we said, "Okay, we have someone who'll kill him for you," and he said, "Well, we'll talk about it later," and dropped the subject. Things were closing in on him. Priscilla wanted more money for the divorce, and he didn't readily have it. He was overextended now as it was. But RCA wondered if Elvis would be interested in selling his master recordings, or back catalog, for $3 million. At first, Parker rejected the offer. Accepting meant the label would never again have to pay royalties on records released before March 1st, 1973, and Elvis would have no control over how the songs would be used. Yet Vernon argued otherwise, insisting it was a quick cure for many of Elvis's financial ills. And so the colonel sat down with RCA's Mel Ilberman, and when he'd finished negotiating, the label paid Elvis $5.4 million for all rights to every one of his songs. It would have been a paltry sum under any circumstances. But then Parker delivered Elvis a second blow, sliding a new management contract before him. All income from Elvis's recordings would now be divided 50-50 from the first dollar, making Elvis and the Colonel pure and equal partners. The RCA monies would be subjected to that agreement, of course, and the Colonel would receive extra monies for his side deals. RCA paid the pair $10.5 million total, and of that, $6 million went to the Colonel, and $4.5 million to Elvis. After taxes, Elvis would see $2 million for the most valuable recordings in the history of popular music. Much of it would go to Priscilla. When the divorce decree was finalized in October 1973, she received a cash payment of $725,000, plus spousal and child support, as well as part of Elvis's new publishing companies, and half the sale of the Hillcrest house. By the time Elvis played the Sahara Tahoe in May 1973, the strain was obvious. He was 30 pounds overweight and lethargic, and canceled a number of shows, going to a local hospital for chest x-rays. Word spread throughout the industry. Barbara Eden followed Elvis into several venues when she was singing, and one of them was Tahoe. The man who hired the talent up there sent me to a doctor one time in the mid-1970s because I had a terrible cold and sore throat. He said, "Use him for this one job, but don't use him for anything else." I asked why. He said, "He's very proud that he took care of Elvis, but I was there when he treated him. Elvis's rear end was like leather. It had been poked so many times with needles to keep him going." It was so very sad, she said. Elvis was like a racehorse that you work too hard and then lose. When Elvis returned to Memphis, the Colonel, furious about the canceled dates, called Vernon about the open dialogue between Elvis's friends and family concerning his abuse of prescription medications. His rant fell on deaf ears. Dr. Nick saw that Vernon's relationship with Elvis wasn't good enough for him to hold any sway, and Vernon, who had a girlfriend and would separate from Dee the following year, didn't truly realize what was going on. Vernon was wrapped up in his little world, and he didn't really want to accept that his son needed any help. That was one big problem. But even Lisa Marie, who often saw her father guzzling pills, knew that something was wrong. One night when I was about 5 or 6, we were watching TV. I looked up at him and said, Daddy, I don't want you to die." And he just looked down at me and said, "Okay, I won't. Don't worry about it." I said that to him several times when we were alone together. I guess I was picking something up. Finally, the Colonel convinced Vernon to let Ed Hookstratton, Elvis's lawyer, open an investigation with John O'Grady to uncover Elvis's source. But Elvis had doctors all over the country: George Nagopoulos in Memphis, Thomas Flash Newman, and Elias Ghanem in Las Vegas, George Kaplan in Palm Springs, and Max Shapiro, the dentist, in Los Angeles. And without his cooperation, nothing could be done. He was into heavy narcotics now, Dilaudid, or synthetic heroin, not just Demerol and sticking Q-tips soaked in liquid cocaine up his nostrils. He'd get whatever he needed wherever he could, even if it meant self-mutilation. Digging a hole in his foot under the guise of an ingrown toenail, or picking at a spot on his hand until you could have parked a truck in it. Really, you could see the bones, according to Lamar. The last 5 years were just horrendous. He failed to show at a recording session that July 1973 at the legendary Stax Studio on Macklemore Avenue, only a few doors down from where he and Dixie Locke had attended the old Assembly of God church. The next night, he arrived late, decked out in outrageous Superfly clothes, a white suit, black cape, and Borsellino slouch hat, with Linda and Lisa Marie in tow. The musicians were shocked at his weight. "It was the first time I ever saw him fat," says drummer Jerry Kerrigan, and most had never heard him so slurry. Erratic and moody, he recorded little of use over several nights of sessions. At one point, Felton couldn't find him and went looking outside. Elvis was there in the dark. "Why are you sitting out here?" Felton asked. The response was soft and slow. "I'm just so tired of playing Elvis Presley." He was back in Vegas in early August, adding only one new song, a cover of actor Richard Harris's Divorce Weeper, My Boy, and receiving devastating reviews of his opening night. The Hollywood Reporter called it one of the most ill-prepared, unsteady, and most disheartening performances. It is a tragedy, and absolutely depressing to see Elvis in such diminishing stature. Pop singer Petula Clark was in the audience that night. She had seen him once before, at a pre-opening show some years earlier, going with her friend Karen Carpenter. He had been great, absolutely fantastic. He was really on form and very handsome and exciting. She and Karen had gone backstage, where he was his usual charming self. Then, quite suddenly, the dressing room was empty except for Elvis, Karen, and myself, as the entourage had left rather strategically. He was very seductive and very heavily flirted with us. Karen was younger than me, and I felt a little bit responsible for her, and after about half an hour I thought, wait a minute. I said to Elvis, "We have to go," and I took Karen's hand and we left. We had a laugh about it because I think that Elvis was rather looking forward to having a threesome with us, and I didn't think that was a good idea, even though there was a bit of spark there. Now, in 1973, Petula had been looking forward to another terrific show, but she saw a very different Elvis that night. He obviously wasn't the same man. He was fooling around on stage, and he was sloppy in his work, not singing everything all the way through. Again, she went backstage, but when Elvis came into the dressing room, Petula was chagrined to see he was out of it, and there were people hanging around telling him what a fantastic show it was, and it wasn't. I stayed about 10 minutes, and it was a very, very sad 10 minutes. The Elvis that we all knew just wasn't there. Marianne Mobley and her husband, actor Gary Collins, also went to see him around this time. He took them back and showed them some of his new wardrobe, but as they talked, Marianne realized he was clinically depressed. He could see no change in his life. It was just going to Vegas, going back to the house, maybe renting out the movie theater, and that's it. No new interests. That's what keeps you going. No one said to him, "Look, we're going to get out of this rut. We're going to charter a plane and fly to Capri or Nice, and we'll have plenty of security and you'll see new places." What good is it to make all that money and to have the following he had and not be excited to get up every day? In October, 2 days after the divorce decree was finalized in Santa Monica, Elvis had trouble breathing. He and Linda flew home to Memphis on a chartered jet, but on the plane, a worried Linda watched as his breathing grew even more labored, despite a constant administration of oxygen. Dr. Nick came out to the house and was shocked to find Elvis swollen almost beyond recognition. The physician left his office nurse, Tish Henley, more or less on permanent duty at Graceland, but when Elvis worsened in the next few days, the physician put him in Baptist Memorial Hospital, where he underwent extensive testing for all of his health concerns. He was having occasional problems controlling his bladder and bowels, he said, conditions that would sometimes leave him incontinent. Dr. Nick asked every question in the world, and that's when he learned that the acupuncture Elvis received in California had been administered with syringes filled with Demerol. Elvis remained in the hospital for 2 weeks to detox. Linda stayed by his side, both because she loved him and to keep him from charming the nurses into bringing him all the drugs he wanted.